They smashed everything, she said, her voice so quiet it barely made it across the phone line. My dad's tools, the diagnostic machine he saved up 3 years to buy, they walked in and destroyed it all. Like it meant nothing. But here's what Richard Holloway never counted on. It meant everything to the right people. And some of those people had been watching Sophie Mitchell a lot longer than she knew. Before we go any further, if you're watching this story right now, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The rain had been falling since early afternoon, the kind of slow-soaking rain that seeps into everything, into the gravel of the parking lot, into the gaps along the garage door frame, into the collar of a work shirt that's been worn too many days in a row. Sophie Mitchell didn't mind rain. She'd grown up working in this garage through every kind of weather Colorado could throw at a person, and she'd learned a long time ago that the work didn't stop because the sky opened up. Engines didn't care about rain. Deadlines didn't care about rain. And the 3 months of overdue invoices sitting in the top drawer of her father's old desk certainly didn't care about rain. She was underneath a 2009 Silverado, a transmission job she'd been nursing along for 2 days, when she heard the front door open. Not the side entrance her regulars used, not the garage bay where customers sometimes wandered in to watch her work. The front door, the one that faced the street and made a particular sound, a low groan on the hinges that her father had always meant to fix and never did. Sophie slid out from under the truck. 3 men stood inside Mitchell Classic Garage, and not one of them had the look of someone whose car had broken down. The first thing she noticed was their shoes. Clean. Too clean for a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of clean that meant they hadn't walked through the parking lot. They'd stepped carefully around every puddle, every patch of wet gravel, because they hadn't come here to get dirty. They'd come here to make a point. The man in front was the tallest, maybe 45, with a jaw that looked like it had been set at a permanent angle of mild contempt. He held a crowbar down at his side, the way a man holds something he's already decided he's going to use. Sophie Mitchell, he said. She set down her wrench. Shop's closed. Signs on the door. We're not here for repairs. I can see that. She straightened up slowly, wiping her hands on a shop rag, buying herself 3 or 4 seconds to think. The workbench was behind her. Her phone was on the workbench. She calculated the distance without moving her eyes. What do you want? The tall man took 1 step forward and looked around the garage the way a buyer looks around a house he's already decided to demolish, not with curiosity, but with a kind of bored arithmetic. Richard Holloway wants this property, he said. He's made you a fair offer, more than fair. You haven't responded. I responded, Sophie said. The answer was no. The man tilted his head slightly. He thought you might want to reconsider. He thought wrong. There was a pause. Not a long one, the kind of pause that happens when someone has already decided what comes next and is just waiting for the clock to run out. Then the tall man nodded once at the 2 men behind him. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of thing that doesn't fully register in real time. Sophie would try to reconstruct it later, lying awake at 2 in the morning, and she'd always find that her memory had broken it into pieces. Separate sounds, separate moments, not a continuous sequence. The crack of a crowbar against the housing of the diagnostic machine her father had spent $3,400 on saving for 3 years before he finally bought it. The particular sound of a tool chest hitting the floor, the shriek of metal on concrete, the pop of the lift hydraulics being forced in a direction they weren't built to go. She screamed at them. She grabbed for her phone and one of them knocked it out of her hand without even turning to look at her. A casual, dismissive gesture, the way you'd swat at something that was briefly in your way. She went for the door and the tall man stepped sideways and blocked her, not aggressively, almost gently, which was somehow worse. We're almost done, he said. And they were. They were methodical about it. They weren't vandals having fun. They were professionals making a statement, and the statement was precise and economical and devastating. They destroyed the things that would cost the most to replace the things that were the hardest to do without, and they left the rest, the coffee maker in the waiting room, the calendar on the wall, the framed photograph of Sophie and her father taken on the day she got her certification. They left all of that untouched because leaving it untouched was part of the message. When they were done, the tall man walked back to the front door and turned around. Mr. Holloway's offer stands for another 30 days, he said. Think carefully. Then they walked out into the rain. Sophie stood alone in the middle of her father's garage and listened to the sound of their car pulling out of the lot. She didn't move for a long time. The rain tapped against the roof. Oil dripped somewhere it wasn't supposed to drip. The diagnostic machine, the one her father had been so proud of, sat in a corner. With its screen shattered, its housing bent in two places, making a faint electronic sound it had never made before. She picked up her phone from the floor. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She walked slowly across the garage and stood in front of the tool wall. Her father had built that wall himself 2 days after they moved into this space. Pegboard and hooks and labels in his handwriting, faded now, but still legible. Every tool in its place, every place labeled, so you never had to think about where something went. A disorganized shop, he used to say, is a shop where people get hurt. She had kept every tool in every place it was supposed to be for 11 years. 3 of the hooks were empty now. She could see the tools on the floor across the room where they had been thrown. This place survived before me, she whispered. Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. I won't be the one who lets it die. She bent down and picked up the first tool. The police report took an hour and a half and resulted in a case number and very little else. The officer who took her statement was polite and thorough and managed to communicate without ever saying it directly that property damage cases involving wealthy developers and small business owners rarely went anywhere fast. He told her to document everything. He told her to save the case number. He told her that someone from the investigation unit would be in touch. She drove home at midnight knowing that no one would be in touch. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that a man named Victor Callahan had been parked across the street from Mitchell Classic Garage since 6:15 that evening. He had not gone inside. He had watched the 3 men arrive. He had watched Sophie's lights flickering through the rain-streaked windows. He had watched the 3 men leave. And then he had sat there for another hour in the dark doing a particular kind of thinking that most people mistake for doing nothing at all. Victor Callahan had been coming to Mitchell Classic Garage for 16 months. He came every Friday afternoon, usually between 2 and 3, and he always brought the same motorcycle, a 1979 Harley-Davidson Shovelhead, that he kept in exceptional condition himself, but he brought it to Sophie every few weeks for a second opinion. He trusted his own hands, he'd told her once, but he didn't trust his own blind spots. Everybody's got a blind spot, he said. Smart people know where theirs is. He was 63 years old. He wore plainclothes work shirts, jeans, boots worn to the exact shape of his feet over decades of use. He had the kind of build that used to be powerful and had settled into something quieter, but hadn't entirely gone away. His hair was gray, cut short, and he had a beard he kept trimmed to about a week's worth of growth always. His hands were the most notable thing about him, large, calloused, marked with small scars in the specific pattern that comes from decades of mechanical work. He didn't talk much. He paid Kai always exact change, always with a $5 tip, regardless of the size of the job. He drank his coffee black. He read the same outdoor magazine from the waiting room stack every single visit without acknowledging that he'd already read it. He never made small talk about himself. Sophie had learned over 16 months exactly 3 facts about Victor Callahan. He had lived in Colorado for 9 years. He preferred mountains to cities. And he had known her father. He had mentioned it once offhand in the way people mention things they assume you already know. Your dad talked about this transmission issue the same way he'd said watching her work. And she'd looked up and asked him when he'd met her father, and he'd looked briefly surprised as though he'd forgotten she wouldn't automatically have this information. Long time ago, he'd said, before your time mostly. She tried to ask more, and he'd let the conversation drift, not rudely but conclusively, the way a door closes when there's no lock involved, gently without drama, but definitely shut. She'd filed it away. She had a lot of things filed away about Victor Callahan. She opened the garage the next morning at 6 o'clock. She had been there since 5:15. She'd spent the first 45 minutes standing in the middle of the floor cataloging the damage with her phone camera, making a list, calculating costs. The diagnostic machine was beyond repair. The main lift was damaged but functional, with restrictions. She couldn't risk heavy loads until she got the hydraulics checked. 2 of her best socket sets were either damaged or missing. The floor was littered with things that needed to be sorted before she could function, and the sorting alone was going to take most of the morning. She opened the doors anyway. The first customer came in at 6:40. Dale Whitmore, 71 years old, drove a 1998 Ford F-150 that he was absolutely convinced would outlive him. He took one look at the garage and his face did something complicated. "What in the hell happened in here?" he said. "Equipment issue," Sophie said. "I've got it handled." Dale stood there for a moment. He was not a man who pushed into other people's business. He'd been coming to this garage since Sophie's father had first opened it when Sophie herself was 4 years old. He had watched her grow up in this space. He understood certain things without being told. "You need help with anything," he said. "I'm fine, Dale. Let's get your truck on the lift." He left the truck and came back at noon, and he brought his wife and his neighbor's son, who turned out to be pretty good with hydraulics. None of them said much about why they'd come. They just worked. That was the first good thing that happened. The second good thing happened at about 2 in the afternoon when a woman named Carol Bridges, who drove a 2012 Civic and had been a regular since Sophie's second year of running the shop, came in for what she said was an oil change. She sat in the waiting room with her magazine, and then when she was getting ready to leave, she stopped at the desk and set down $300 in cash. "That's not for the oil change," Carol said. "The oil change is on the card. That's for whatever you need it for." She held up a hand before Sophie could respond. "Don't make a thing of it. Your father fixed my car the week before my daughter was born and charged me $40 when the market rate was twice that. This is 16 years overdue." Sophie held the money and didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," she finally said. "Just stay open," Carol said. "That's all I'm asking."
Get them to sign me.
Richard Holloway was not a man who raised his voice. People who raise their voices, he had learned early in his career, are people who've lost control of the situation. Richard had built Holloway Development into a $40 million operation over 22 years by never losing control of a situation. By the time he was 47, he had the kind of face that seemed designed to project reasonableness, friendly creases around the eyes, and easy smile. The whole arrangement suggesting a man who liked people and whom people liked back. He sat in his office and on the 14th floor of a building he owned and looked at the photographs his associate had taken of Mitchell Classic Garage the previous evening. Before photographs, he had seen enough of these to read them quickly. "She didn't sell overnight," he said. "No," his associate said. "Did she call the police?" "She did. And case number, standard damage report, nothing moving." Richard set the photographs down. He had been patient about the Mitchell property for 8 months. It was not a large parcel, less than half an acre, with a building that was worth next to nothing. But the location was exactly right for the western entrance of the Red Valley luxury development, and the survey lines made it non-negotiable. He needed that corner. He had needed that corner for 18 months, and for the last 8 of those months, he had been waiting for Sophie Mitchell to do what everyone in her position eventually did, which was to recognize the reality of her situation and take the money. She hadn't. He had increased the offer twice. He had sent lawyers twice. He had now sent the other kind of messenger, and that hadn't worked either. This was mildly interesting to him, the way a puzzle is interesting. Not worrying, not yet, but interesting. "What's her financial picture look like?" he said. His associate had a folder ready. He always had a folder ready. "Tight," he said. "She took on the lease when her father passed, and the equipment loan has about 18 months left. Monthly revenue covers operating costs with about $800 to $1,200 left over, depending on the month. She doesn't have a lot of room. Suppliers. 3 primary, all of them are open to a conversation about their terms." Richard picked up his coffee cup. "Then have that conversation," he said, "and see if anyone in her customer base has been talking to her about the business. If she's leaning on people for support, I want to know who they are." So, the supplier situation started 3 weeks after the break-in. Precision Auto Parts, which had been Sophie's primary supplier for 6 years, called on a Tuesday morning to inform her that they were restructuring their credit arrangements with small accounts, and her net 30 terms would be changing to payment in advance effective immediately. The man on the phone was apologetic in the specific way that means someone has told him exactly what to say and he's saying it. Sophie asked for a supervisor. The supervisor was less apologetic and more certain. She called her secondary supplier and got a different story that amounted to the same thing: longer lead times, less favorable pricing, a general sense that her account was suddenly less welcome than it had been. She sat at her father's desk after the second call and did the math. She had done the math so many times in the past 3 weeks that she barely needed paper anymore. The numbers had a way of rearranging themselves into the same shape no matter how she looked at them. Without normal supplier terms, her cash flow would require her to front costs she normally paid on 30-day delay, which meant she needed about $4,000 more in working capital than she currently had, which meant she was either going to start turning down jobs she couldn't finance up front, or she was going to go further into the credit she'd already stretched pretty thin. "You son of a gun," she said quietly to no one. She wasn't talking about the man on the phone. She understood now what Richard Holloway was doing. The crowbars had been a message, but this was the actual plan. He wasn't going to come back and break more things. That had been a one-time demonstration, a way of communicating his seriousness. What he was actually going to do was much more careful. He was going to make the math not work slowly, methodically, without leaving fingerprints. He was going to remove the air from around her a cubic foot at a time, and eventually the garage would close on its own and his hands would be completely clean. She picked up the phone and called every customer she'd served in the past 2 years. It took her 4 days working evenings after the shop closed. She called 116 people. She told each one of them the same thing, that the garage was going through some changes, that she wanted them to know she was still here, still open, still the same shop her father had built. She did not tell them what was actually happening. She asked how their cars were running. She asked if there was anything they'd been putting off that she could help with. 63 of them came in within the following 2 weeks. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Victor Callahan came in on a Friday as always. He didn't have anything specific that needed doing on the shovelhead. He sat in the waiting room and drank his coffee while Sophie finished up with a brake job on a minivan, and when she came out to hand the keys back to the owner, she found him looking at the spot on the wall where the diagnostic machine used to be. "Moving the machine," he said. She sat down across from him. The waiting room had 4 chairs and a small table with magazines and a coffee maker and a window that looked out at the parking lot. It was the same waiting room that had been here when she was a child, and she had repainted it twice and replaced the chairs once, but it still felt exactly like the room she'd grown up knowing. "It's gone," she said. She watched his face carefully. Nothing moved. "What happened to it?" he said, and she told him. She hadn't told many people the full version Dale and his crew knew. Some of it, Carol knew some of it, but she'd been careful not to spread the story around because she didn't know yet what telling it would cost her. But something about the way Victor asked the question, the absolute stillness of his expression, made her lay it out completely. The 3 men, the crowbars, the supplier calls, the math. Holloway development in the luxury project, and the 18 months of offers and what came after the offers stopped. Victor listened without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down when it was empty and held it in both hands. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Keep opening every morning," she said. "Keep answering the phone. Keep doing the work." "And if that's not enough," she looked at him. "Then it won't be enough," she said. "But it'll be because I ran out of runway, not because I gave up." Victor looked at the empty wall where the machine had been. He had the expression of a man working through a calculation that involved more variables than the ones that were visible. "Good answer," he said. He paid his usual visit charge, exact change plus $5, and rode his shovel head out of the parking lot. Sophie watched him go from the waiting room window, the way she sometimes did, tracking the sound of that engine, until it dropped below the range of hearing. She didn't know then what was turning over behind his eyes. She didn't know what that calculation was adding up to. She would. The rumor started in the second week of November. She heard it first from Dale Whitmore, who heard it from someone at the hardware store, who had heard it from someone who claimed to have talked to a person who worked for Holloway Development. The rumor was that Mitchell Classic Garage was closing before the end of the year, that Sophie Mitchell had already accepted a buyout, that the building was going to be demolished in January. It wasn't true. Not one word of it was true. But by the time a rumor has traveled from a hardware store through 3 separate people on its way to its subject, the truth of it has become largely irrelevant. What matters is the shape the rumor takes in people's minds. When they're deciding whether to schedule a repair or not, whether to recommend the shop to a friend, or not, whether to call and ask about that noise their engine has been making or just start looking for somewhere else. 3 customers called to ask if they should reschedule their appointments. One of them, a man named Gary Tillman, who had been a loyal customer for 5 years, called to say he'd heard she was closing and he was sorry to hear it, and where did she think he should take his Jeep going forward. She told him the rumor was false. She told all 4 of them the rumor was false. Gary Tillman rescheduled his appointment. The other 3 didn't. She hung up from the last call and sat at her desk for a long time without moving. The room was very quiet. The garage was empty. It was past 7. She'd been working the phone and the last car had gone out at 5:30. Outside, Red Valley was settling into the particular stillness of a cold Tuesday evening. The kind of quiet that had always felt comfortable to her. The kind of quiet her father used to say was the garage's way of telling you the day was done. Tonight, it just felt like silence. She pulled open the top drawer of her father's desk. It was the drawer she always kept closed. The drawer with the invoices and the bills and the documents that represented the full weight of the situation she was in. She looked at the number she'd already looked at 100 times. Then she took out something she hadn't looked at in a while, a photograph. Not the framed one on the wall, but a smaller one worn at the corners from being handled. Her father in the garage, probably 15 years ago, standing next to an old muscle car he'd just finished restoring. He was grinning ear to ear in the way he only grinned when something mechanical had just done exactly what it was supposed to do. He had grease on his forehead, and he'd clearly not noticed. "What would you do?" she said to the photograph. She already knew. He would open the doors at 6 in the morning. He would call every customer. He would fix at every car. He would do the work. She put the photograph back. She set her alarm for 5:15. But before she turned off the desk lamp, she opened the drawer one more time. Underneath the invoices at the very bottom was a business card, plain white, slightly bent at one corner. Nothing on it except a phone number handwritten in Victor Callahan's careful, precise script. He had left it on the counter 6 weeks ago without explanation or ceremony, sliding it across the glass surface while she was writing up his receipt. "In case you need to reach me," he'd said, "I don't always keep the same schedule." She'd meant to ask him about it and never had. She held the card now and looked at the number and thought about the particular quality of Victor Callahan's silences, the way they felt inhabited, the way a room feels when someone is standing very still in the corner of it. She put the card in her shirt pocket. She turned off the light. She'd keep opening the doors. She'd keep doing the work. She'd keep fighting this the way she knew how to fight it. But she was starting to understand that she was in a war with someone who had more resources, more reach, and more patience than she'd originally calculated. And wars, her father had once told her, were not always won by the side that was most right. They were won by the side that refused to stop. She walked out of the garage and locked the door behind her. The cold hit her face like water. She stood there for a moment in the parking lot in the dark, listening to the town around her. Somewhere on the highway, a truck engine was building up speed on the on-ramp. Somewhere near the old part of downtown, a dog was barking at something that wasn't there. Overhead clouds moved fast across a slice of sky, and for a moment the stars were visible, and then they weren't. She thought about the diagnostic machine. She thought about the 3 men in their clean shoes. She thought about Richard Holloway sitting somewhere tonight, comfortable, patient, methodical, tightening the screws. Another quarter turn, in the dark. And then she thought about Victor Callahan and the way he'd asked her that question. Not the polite version, not "what are you planning to do," but the real version. The one underneath the polite version. "What are you going to do?" "You keep opening every morning," she had said. "Keep doing the work." She meant it, but she was also beginning to understand that some fights required you to know who was in your corner before you found out who wasn't. She put her hand in her shirt pocket and felt the edge of the business card. Not tonight. Tonight she was going home. But she was going to call that number. And when she did, she was finally going to ask Victor Callahan who he really was. She called the number on a Thursday morning before she opened the shop. Victor picked up on the second ring. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not about the motorcycle." A pause. Brief. "I know," he said. "I'll be there at noon." He showed up at 11:58. She had the coffee ready. She told herself she wasn't going to lead with emotion, wasn't going to let the exhaustion of the past several weeks show in the way she held herself, because she'd learned early that when you let people see how tired you are, they start making decisions for you that you should be making yourself. But when Victor walked through the side door and looked at her across the waiting room, something in his expression made the careful composure she'd built up over 3 weeks feel like a very thin coat of paint over something that had been soaking in water for too long. She poured the coffee and sat down across from him and said, "Who are you?" Victor wrapped both hands around the mug. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "What do you already know?" he said. "I know you knew my father. I know you've been coming here for 16 months, and I've never heard you talk about your life before Red Valley. I know you left me that card 6 weeks ago before any of this got this bad, which means you saw something coming that I didn't." She held his gaze. "And I know that when I told you what happened, you didn't look surprised, not once." Victor was quiet for long enough that she heard the refrigerator in the back kick on and then off again. "Your father," he said finally, "fixed my bike in the spring of 2004. I was coming through Red Valley on my way somewhere I won't bore you with. Chain had come loose on the highway, and I'd ridden about 6 miles on instinct before I admitted to myself I had a problem." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Pulled into this garage on a Tuesday afternoon. Your dad was the only one here. He looked at the bike, looked at me, didn't say much, and fixed the chain in about 20 minutes. Wouldn't take more than the cost of parts. Said something about how doing the right thing was its own payment." He paused. "I tried to argue with him about it." "He was like that," Sophie said. "I know. I tried to argue with about 6 different versions of that same generosity over the years, and he won every time." Victor set down the mug. "I came back, not right away, a few months later, then again. And eventually your father and I had enough conversations that we were something like friends, even though we were very different kinds of men." "What kind of man are you?" Sophie said. Victor looked at her steadily. "The kind who spent a long time riding with the Hells Angels." The coffee maker made a sound in the corner. Outside, a car passed on the street. Sophie kept her eyes on Victor's face and waited. "Not as an active member anymore," he said. "I've been out of that life for 9 years. That's why I'm in Red Valley if you want the truth, because Red Valley is small and quiet and very far from everything I used to be involved with. But I didn't leave because I was ashamed of my brothers. I left because I was tired and because I'd done enough." He paused. "What I'm telling you is that I'm not that man anymore. But I know who those men are. I know how they think. I know what they're capable of, and I know what they'll do when someone they respect calls them and tells them that something needs to be made right." Sophie sat with that for a moment. "You've been watching this situation," she said. "Since the first time Holloway's lawyers came to see you," he said. "One of your regulars mentioned it to me without knowing I was paying particular attention. And I started watching because I know how these things go, and I wanted to know if this was the kind of thing that was going to stay uncomfortable or whether it was going to turn into something else. And the night they came in with the crowbars," he said, "I was across the street." Something moved through Sophie's chest that she couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not exactly. Something more complicated, a recognition that she had been less alone during these weeks, than she'd believed that someone had been present for the worst moment without telling her, and she couldn't decide yet whether that made her feel protected or exposed. "Why didn't you come in?" she said. "Because they didn't hurt you," he said. "If they'd hurt you, I would have come in. But they were making a business man, not a threat against your person, and if I had come in that night, I would have turned a property dispute into something with a much bigger fire. I didn't think that served you." He held her gaze. "I could have been wrong about that. If I was wrong, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. "You weren't wrong," she said slowly. "But I need you to be straight with me about everything from here on. No more watching from across the street." "Agreed. And I need to know what you're actually offering," she said, "because I'm not going to accept help I don't understand. Tell me plainly what you're thinking." Victor leaned back slightly. "What I'm thinking," he said, "is that Richard Holloway has built his whole operation on the assumption that people like you don't have anyone in their corner who can match his reach. He uses lawyers when he needs to look clean, and other people when he needs something dirtier, and it works because most small business owners don't have any kind of leverage to push back with. He guts the support structure, he runs the rumors, he tightens the money, and eventually the door closes on its own and his hands are spotless." He paused. "But what he doesn't know, what he couldn't know, is that the woman he's doing this to has a connection to someone who spent 30 years building loyalty with people who don't walk away. I don't want anyone to get hurt, Sophie said immediately. Nobody's going to get hurt, Victor said. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about presence, about making it clear to Richard Holloway that this situation has changed shape on him, that he is no longer operating in the dark against someone who's isolated. He picked up his coffee mug again. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply make someone understand that the odds have shifted. Sophie looked at her own hands, calloused like her father's, stained at the cuticles from a lifetime of work that didn't fully wash out. Why, she said, why would you do this for me? Because your father did something for me when he didn't have to, Victor said. And because he's not here to see what's being done to his garage. And because he stopped for a moment and something moved across his face that was more personal than anything he'd shown her before. Because I've watched good things get dismantled by people with money and patience and no conscience. And there came a point in my life when I decided I was done watching. The room was quiet. Okay, Sophie said. Okay. Okay, she said again. Tell me what you need from me. Victor almost smiled. Right now, keep doing exactly what you're doing. Open at 6, answer the phone, do the work. Don't change a single thing about how you're operating. I don't want Holloway to see any shift until it's too late for him to adjust to it. And you? I'm going to make some phone calls, he said. The calls Victor made over the next 10 days were not the kind Sophie would ever fully know about. She knew he made them. She saw evidence of them in the way the air around the situation seemed to quietly pressurize, the way you feel a weather system changing before you can see it in the sky. But the specific conversations, the names, the content, those happen in the particular privacy that comes with decades of trust built between people who had learned not to need written records. What she did know was that on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after their conversation, Dale Whitmore came into the shop and told her that he'd heard something from his cousin, who drove long haul and had stopped at a truck stop outside Denver the night before. He said he was talking to a couple of guys at the counter. Dale said his voice carrying the particular texture of a man working out whether something is significant. Bikers, older guys, he said, very polite, and he mentioned Red Valley for some reason, said that's where he was headed, and apparently these two guys got real interested. Asked him, did he know a place called Mitchell Classic Garage? Dale looked at Sophie carefully. He told them yes. They told him to give their regards to the owner and said the place had a lot of friends he didn't know about. Sophie kept her face calm. That's nice, she said. Dale studied her. Anything you want to tell me, Sophie? Your brake line needs attention on the left rear, she said. I noticed it when I was pulling the truck in. Want me to quote you on that? Dale accepted the deflection because he was a man who respected people's right to manage their own affairs. But he looked at her for one more second before he let it go, and she could see in that look that he'd filed the truck stop story in the same drawer where he kept the other things he'd noticed and not asked about. The first real crack appeared in the second week of December. Precision Auto Parts called on a Monday morning. Not the account representative who had delivered the terms change 6 weeks earlier. The regional manager. He introduced himself and said he wanted to revisit the terms adjustment that had been made to her account. Sophie gripped the phone and made her voice absolutely level. I'm listening. We've had some internal review of our small business accounts in the Mountain West region, he said, using the careful language of someone who has been told to fix something without being told why it broke. And we think the adjustment to your account may have been premature. We'd like to offer you a return to your previous net 30 terms effective immediately, and we want to extend an additional 15-day grace period for the next 2 billing cycles as a goodwill gesture. Sophie was quiet for 3 full seconds. What changed, she said. We've been reevaluating our regional relationships, he said. I see, she said. I appreciate the call. Let's put the terms back in writing and I'll sign today. She hung up the phone and sat very still at her father's desk. Then she took out her phone and called Victor. He answered after 1 ring. Precision Auto Parts just called, she said. They're reinstating my terms. A pause. Good, he said. Victor? She waited. What happened? One of the principals at Precision has an old business relationship with someone I know, Victor said. That person had a conversation with our principal. The substance of the conversation was that Mitchell Classic Garage is a place with a great deal of community support, and that any business decisions made under outside pressure regarding this account would be noticed by a fairly wide circle of people who are paying attention. You made them understand that cutting me off was a bad business decision. Something like that. Is that going to hold? Yes, Victor said, because the person who made that call is someone whose word carries weight, and the principal at Precision is smart enough to understand what that weight means. Sophie exhaled. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Victor said. Holloway's going to notice. When his pressure points stop working, he's going to reassess. He's not going to back off. He's going to push harder. Be ready for that. What's harder look like? I don't know yet, Victor said, but I'll know before it gets to you. She believed him. That was the thing she noticed about herself over those weeks, that she had started believing Victor Callahan in the particular way you believe someone who has never once made a promise they didn't mean. He wasn't reassuring. He didn't tell her things were going to be fine. He told her what was real and what he was doing about what was real, and then he let the results speak. It was exactly how her father had operated. And she recognized the shape of it, the way you recognize a handwriting style you grew up reading. Business picked up in December. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady way that genuine word of mouth moves one person telling another, one repaired car leading to a mention over dinner that led to a phone call on a Saturday morning. She ran full days 3 weeks in a row. She cleared 3 months of financial tension in 2 weeks and started to see for the first time since the break-in a number in her checking account that didn't require her to run a mental calculation every time she thought about buying parts. She hired back Ray Gutierrez, who had worked for her father for 9 years and had taken a job at the dealership service center across town when the garage's financial picture had started looking uncertain. Ray showed up on his first Monday back and walked through the shop like a man returning to a house he'd grown up in, touching tools, checking the alignment of equipment, nodding to himself. Heard you had some trouble, Ray said. Some, she said. We're handling it. Ray nodded and picked up a clipboard. Then let's get the bay organized. We've got a full schedule. Richard Holloway was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who paid close attention to patterns, and the pattern he was seeing in the second week of December did not match a model he'd operated from before. His associate stood across the desk and delivered the update with the measured tone of someone reporting data and not interpretation. Precision Auto Parts had reversed the terms change. The rumor campaign about the garage closing had lost traction. In fact, the opposite narrative appeared to be gaining ground, something about community support, about people rallying around the shop. 3 other businesses he'd quietly leaned on to deprioritize referrals to Mitchell Classic had also quietly unleaned in the other direction without any direct communication to his team about why. Somebody's working the room, Richard said. Yes, his associate said. We're not certain who. Find out. We're looking. Richard stood up and went to the window, which was a thing he did when he was thinking about something that required reframing. He looked at the city below him and made the familiar calculation. He'd been in harder situations than one small garage owner who'd found herself some allies. He'd been through situations where the opposition was organized, funded, and loud, and he'd won all of them because winning required patience and the ability to absorb costs, and he had both. Go back to the property, he said. His associate paused. In what sense? She's not selling. She's never going to sell on her own, so we shift the approach. He turned back from the window. The property is zoned commercial. I want to know every zoning variance she's relying on, every permit that's up for renewal, every code compliance question we can raise with the county. I want this done through legitimate channels, nothing that can be traced back to us directly. We file the inquiries through third parties and let the regulatory process do what the regulatory process does. That could take months. That's fine, Richard said. Months is fine. She's already stretched. Every month that passes is another month her margins get thinner. And if we can create enough regulatory uncertainty to dry up her financing options, the math is going to solve itself. He sat back down. But I want someone to find out who's helping her. Because whoever this is, they're operating with resources, and I want to understand what I'm actually dealing with. Sophie found out about the zoning inquiries from a county clerk named Patricia Ellison, who had known her father for 20 years and called her on a Thursday afternoon to give her what Patricia described as a heads up between friends. There have been 3 separate code compliance inquiries filed about your property in the last 10 days, Patricia said. Separate filers, but the inquiries they're very similar. The way the questions are worded. Meaning someone coordinated them, Sophie said. I'm not in a position to say that, Patricia said carefully. What I can tell you is that it would be worth your while to get your permits in order and maybe talk to someone who knows about zoning law because these inquiries are going to generate responses that need to be handled correctly. Patricia, Sophie said, thank you. Your father was a good man, Patricia said. Just get your paperwork right. She hung up and immediately called Victor. He answered on the first ring this time. She'd noticed he'd been doing that lately, picking up faster, as though he was keeping the phone closer. Holloway's moved to regulatory, she said, and told him everything Patricia had said. Victor was quiet for a moment. That's smart, he said. Harder to fight than direct pressure because it looks legitimate from the outside. Can we fight it? We can, he said, but this one needs a lawyer, not muscle. I know someone. Another pause. There's something else I need to tell you. Something in his voice shifted. Not urgency exactly, but density, more weight behind the words. What? She said. My associate found out who's been making inquiries about you, about who's backing you, Victor said. Holloway has been asking questions, and some of those questions have made it to people who know me. Not by name, not yet, but close enough. He paused. He's going to find out what he's dealing with eventually. When he does, he might escalate in a way that's harder to manage quietly. Define harder to manage. He might decide that instead of regulatory and financial pressure, he wants to make a statement, Victor said. The kind of statement he made the first night, but a bigger. Sophie processed that. He'd send people back. He might. I don't know that he will, but I want you to know I'm thinking about it. And if he does, Victor's voice was even, then the situation becomes something different than it's been so far. Victor, she said, yeah. Don't let it get there without telling me first. I don't want to be the last person to know what's happening round in my own garage. A short silence. So, agreed, he said. I'll keep you in front of it. She believed him. But in the back of her mind, in the part of her that had been raised around mechanical systems and understood that things which are already under stress will fail at the point of greatest pressure, she knew that the quiet intervention period was drawing to a close. The suppliers had come back. The referrals were flowing again. The community had rallied in all the small, practical ways that communities rally. And none of it had changed the fundamental fact that Richard Holloway wanted that corner of land for his development, and that a man like Richard Holloway did not change what he wanted simply because the situation had become more complicated. He adapted. She was going to have to adapt with him. The lawyer Victor knew was a woman named Diane Crowell, 61 years old, who had spent the first 20 years of her career in commercial real estate law in Denver and had moved to smaller markets by choice because she found the work more interesting when the stakes were human-sized. She drove into Red Valley on a Friday morning and sat across from Sophie at the same waiting room table where Sophie had coffee with Victor and looked at everything Patricia Ellison had described. She worked quietly for about 15 minutes reading and making notes, and then she looked up. These inquiries are baseless, she said. All three of them. Your permits are current, your zoning is standard commercial, and the compliance questions they're raising either don't apply to your property class or were already addressed in your father's original permitting in 1989. She set down her pen. Whoever filed these knows they're baseless. The purpose isn't to find actual violations. The purpose is to generate a cloud of uncertainty around the property title and create complications for any refinancing you might try to do. Can I fight them? Absolutely, Diane said. I'll file responses to all three within the week. Clean, factual, documented. The inquiries will be closed and the record will show they were unfounded. She paused. That takes care of this round, but you should know that this is a tactic that can be repeated. If the person doing this is patient, they can file new inquiries every 6 to 8 weeks, each one requiring a response, each one adding legal fees. How do I stop the cycle? Diane looked at her for a moment. You make the cost of repeating the cycle higher than the benefit, she said, which means making the person doing this understand that the responses are coming, the inquiries are being documented, and at some point the pattern itself becomes evidence of a coordinated campaign to interfere with a business, which is a different legal situation entirely. You'd take this further if it came to that, Sophie said. I'd enjoy taking this further, Diane said. She had a very particular smile, dry and precise, like someone who has spent decades watching powerful people underestimate process. Victor tells me you're the kind of person who deserves a fair fight. That's the only kind of client I'm interested in. Sophie looked at her. He said that. He said it, and he meant it, Diane said. And Victor Callahan doesn't say things he doesn't mean. I've known him for 15 years. It's his most reliable quality and also occasionally his most inconvenient one. You've known him since before he retired, Sophie said. It wasn't a question. Diane picked up her pen. I represented some of his associates on various matters over the years, she said carefully. That's all I'll say about that. She looked back at her notes. Now, tell me everything about the timeline of Holloway's approaches from the first offer to today. I want to understand the full picture. Sophie told her. When she was done, Diane had filled 4 pages of her legal pad. He's overextended himself, Diane said finally. He's used too many pressure points in too short a timeline. There are patterns here that become provable with the right documentation. She paused. Did you keep records of the supplier calls? I kept notes, Sophie said. Dates, times, names, what was said. Good. Diane looked at her with the kind of respect that doesn't get performed, that just sits there quiet and certain. Your father taught you to document things. He taught me everything. Then let's get to work, Diane said. It was 3 days later, on a Monday morning, with a full bay schedule, and Ray in the shop, and coffee on, and everything functioning the way it was supposed to function, that Sophie was underneath a 2004 F-15. Oh, listening to the transmission tell her its story when she heard the door open. She slid out. Victor stood in the entryway. He wasn't in his usual Friday afternoon configuration. He was wearing his jacket, and his expression had the focused quality that she'd come to recognize as him having decided something. He found out, Victor said. Sophie stood up. Found out what? Who I am, Victor said. Someone in his network made the connection. He knows my name. He knows my history. He looked at her steadily, and based on what my sources are telling me, his reaction was not to back down. Sophie felt the thing in her chest that she'd been keeping carefully managed for weeks begin to heat up. What is his reaction? Victor's voice stayed even. He's made the calculation that the way to resolve this is to demonstrate that even my involvement doesn't change the outcome. That if he can still close this garage down despite everything, it sends a message that he's untouchable. He paused. He's planning something, Sophie. Something bigger than what he's done before. The garage was very quiet around them. When, she said. I don't know exactly, Victor said. Soon, my best information says within the next week or 2. Sophie looked at him. At this man she'd been knowing for 16 months without knowing him at all, and then for the last several weeks had been knowing in a completely different way. At the lines in his face, the steadiness behind his eyes, the particular quality of calm that came from having seen genuinely hard things and come out the other side. What do we do, she said. Victor met her gaze, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something moving behind his composure. Not fear, not uncertainty, something more like decision. Like a door that has been standing ajar for weeks, quietly swinging open. I make a call, he said. One call. And then this situation becomes something Richard Holloway has never dealt with before. Sophie held his gaze for a long moment. Make it, she said. Victor made the call that night. Sophie didn't hear it happen. She was at home, sitting at her kitchen table with Diane Crowell's 4 pages of legal notes spread out in front of her. Trying to read the same paragraph about zoning variance documentation for the 4th time without retaining a single word of it. Her mind kept circling back to what Victor had said in the garage that morning. One call, and then this situation becomes something Richard Holloway has never dealt with before. She trusted him. That was the remarkable thing, given that 6 weeks ago she hadn't known what he was. She trusted him the way you trust a structural beam that has been holding weight in a building for decades without complaint, not blindly, but based on evidence that had accumulated slowly and held up every time she'd tested it. She turned off the kitchen light at 11:30 and lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the eaves of the house her father had rented for the last 12 years of his life. The house she'd taken over when he passed, and she thought about the phone call Victor was making somewhere in Red Valley at this hour, and what it was setting in motion. She thought about momentum, about how in mechanical systems, a process that has been building pressure for long enough will eventually require a release point, and how the skill was not in preventing the release, but in controlling where it happened. She was asleep before midnight. She dreamed about engines. Diane. Victor called a man named Cal Briggs. Cal was 67, living outside Flagstaff, Arizona, and he had ridden with Victor for 22 years before Victor retired. He was the kind of man that words like intimidating were designed for and still somehow undersold. He had spent those 22 years being the person that the Brotherhood sent when they needed someone who could read a room in 3 seconds and make a decision that held. He had a voice like something geological, slow and certain in the way that rock formations are certain, and he had not spoken to Victor in 8 months, which was a normal gap between them and meant nothing in either direction. He picked up on the third ring and said, "Callahan," in the way people say a name when they are not surprised to hear from you, but are interested in your timing. "I have a situation," Victor said. "Talk." Victor talked for 11 minutes. He gave Cal the full picture. Sophie the garage, her father, the break-in, Holloway the regulatory campaign, Diane Crowell, and what his sources were telling him about Holloway's next move. He talked without editorializing, without asking for anything directly, laying it out the way you lay out a map and let the other person orient themselves. When he was done, Cal was quiet for a moment. "Tom Mitchell's daughter," Cal said. "Oh, yes. Tom fixed my exhaust back in 2007, Cal said. "Wouldn't charge me labor. Said the parts were enough." Victor almost smiled. He did that. And now somebody's trying to take his garage from his girl. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. The particular length of pause that is not hesitation, but inventory. A man going through what he has and what he can move and how fast. "How much time do we have?" Cal said. "A week, maybe less," Victor said. "My information isn't precise." "It's never precise," Cal said. "That's why you move before it gets precise." A breath. "I'll make some calls. You'll hear back by morning." Victor said, "Thank you." Cal said, "Don't thank me. Tom Mitchell charged me $14 for parts on a job that should have cost $300. This is $14 with interest." The call ended. Victor sat in the quiet of his small house on the edge of Red Valley and looked at the wall for a while. Then he got up and made coffee and drank it at the kitchen table while the town slept around him, and he thought about Tom Mitchell, who had been a genuinely good man, in the specific way that doesn't come with any announcement attached. Who would charge people what things cost, and sometimes less, not because he was a poor businessman, but because he had decided early on what kind of person he was going to be, and he'd never revisited the decision. Victor thought about the first time he'd walked into Mitchell Classic Garage. The loose chain, the highway, the long admission to himself that he needed help. Tom's complete absence of judgment, his simple competence, the 20 minutes of work that had gotten Victor back on the road. The refusal of extra money. "Doing the right thing is payment enough," Tom had said. Victor had thought about that sentence off and on for 19 years. Sophie opened the shop at 6 the next morning and found Dale Whitmore's truck already in the parking lot. Dale was sitting in the cab drinking from a thermos. He got out when she pulled up, and he had the look of a man who had decided something before going to bed and was here to act on it. "I heard some things," he said. Sophie unlocked the door. "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that made my wife tell me to mind my own business, and then reminded me that your father gave her mother a discount on a brake job in 2003 when they were between paychecks. And so my wife then told me that maybe this was my business after all." He followed her inside. "What do you need?" She poured them both coffee and told him the broad shape of it, not the Victor parts, not the specifics of what was coming, but enough, the regulatory filings, the ongoing pressure, the sense that Holloway was building towards something. Dale listened the way men of his generation listened, which was without interruption and with the full weight of his attention. "You've got people," he said when she was done. "I've got people," she said. "Good." He drank his coffee. "Because I've got people too, and some of them have been wanting to do something useful since the night those guys came in with crowbars. They've just been waiting for someone to tell them what useful looks like." He set the mug down. "You tell me what you need. Doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes a thing just needs witnesses." Sophie looked at him. 71 years old, arthritic in both knees, drove a truck he'd owned for 26 years, had been coming to this garage since before she could read. "Thank you, Dale," she said. "Stop thanking people," he said. Your father never thanked people for doing the right thing. He just assumed they would. She laughed. Oh my God. It was the first time she'd laughed in 3 weeks, and it surprised her with how real it felt. The call Victor had been waiting for came at 8:15 in the morning while he was eating toast at his kitchen table. It was not Cal. It was a man named Reyes who rode out of Pueblo and was 3 years younger than Victor and had been the chapter's primary logistics mind for most of the time Victor had been active. Reyes spoke quickly and without wasted words, which was his defining characteristic. Cal reached out last night, Reyes said. I talked to 7 people. All 7 said yes before I finished explaining. I stopped explaining and just started calling. A pause. We're looking at somewhere between 30 and 40 riders, depending on the final count. Cal's coming himself. Couple guys from Denver, couple from Albuquerque, some from closer. Victor set down his toast. We need a window. You said a week, maybe less. I'll work on tightening that window today, Victor said. But I need everyone to understand what this is and what it isn't. This isn't a confrontation. This is presence. We show up, we stand there, and we let Holloway's people understand that the math has changed. Everybody understands that, Reyes said. These aren't kids, they know the difference. I know they do, Victor said. I just need it said. It's been said 3 times. A dry pause. You always were particular about the briefing. Saved a lot of problems over the years. It did, Reyes admitted. We'll be ready when you call. Victor hung up and immediately dialed a number he'd been cultivating for the past 10 days. A man named Derek who worked a machine shop 2 blocks from Holloway Development's main office and had, over the course of several casual conversations, become a reliable source of ambient information about Holloway's scheduling and movements. Tonight, Derek said when Victor asked. Word I'm getting is tonight's when they move. Holloway flew out this morning supposedly. Business in Phoenix gives him an alibi. Victor felt the familiar compression in his chest that happened when a timeline suddenly accelerated. How certain? 80%, Derek said. My guy heard it from someone on the crew, not from management. So it could be tonight, could be tomorrow. But Holloway leaving town today is not a coincidence. Thank you, Victor said. He hung up and called Cal. Tonight or tomorrow, he said. I need everyone in Red Valley by this afternoon. A very brief pause. We'll be there by 4, Cal said. Where do you want people staged? I'll send you an address, Victor said. Away from the garage. I don't want anything visible until it needs to be visible. Smart, Cal said. 4 o'clock. Victor ended the call and sat for exactly 30 seconds doing nothing, which was his version of taking a breath. Then he called Sophie. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear Ray in the background, the sound of an air wrench, the comfortable noise of a working shop. Clear your schedule for after 6 tonight, Victor said. And don't leave the garage until I get there. A short silence. Is it tonight? Possibly. I don't know for certain, but I'm not willing to bet on tomorrow. He paused. Call Dale Whitmore. Tell him you need him at the garage after closing him and whoever else he mentioned. Don't tell him why, just that you'd feel better with people around. Victor. Her voice had changed registers slightly, not scared, but serious the way a person's voice gets when they're looking directly at something instead of at the shape of it. How bad is this going to be? That depends on how many people Holloway sends and what they see when they get here, Victor said. But I can tell you this, the worst it could have been is already being handled. By the time anything reaches your garage tonight, this situation will look very different to whoever Holloway sent than it looked when he sent them. Because of the call you made. Because of a lot of calls, he said. Your father collected debts he didn't know he was owed Sophie. Tonight some of them come in. She was quiet for a moment. I'll call Dale, she said. I'll stay. Good, he said. I'll be there by 5. The afternoon moved with the peculiar stretched quality of time when you're waiting for something you can't speed up. Sophie ran through the shop schedule in the front half of her mind and kept the back half occupied with calculations she couldn't fully complete because she didn't have all the variables. Ray knew something was up. He had the instincts of someone who had worked in close quarters with other people for decades and could read atmospheric pressure the way some people read weather. He didn't ask. He worked steadily through the afternoon, and at 4 o'clock, without being told, he started putting the shop in order with more thoroughness than the usual end-of-day routine. Locking the secondary bay, he said. Yes, Sophie said. Tools secured. Please. Ray nodded and went to do it. He had the expression of a man who has made the decision to be useful and is executing on that decision without requiring a full briefing, and Sophie loved him for it, in the wordless way you love the people who show up right. Dale arrived at 4:45 with his neighbor Tom Reeves and Tom's son Marcus, who was 26 and had arms like something structural and a personality of absolute calm that made him seem older. They brought coffee in a thermos and took up space in the waiting room with the particular quality of men who have come somewhere to be there and not to do anything in particular yet. Victor arrived at 5:03 on the shovelhead. He came inside and stood in the middle of the garage and looked around in the way he always looked around, methodically taking in what was there and what had changed since he'd last been here. He looked at Dale and Tom and Marcus and nodded to them. They nodded back. "Thank you for coming," Victor said. "Didn't have anything on," Dale said. Victor almost smiled. He turned to Sophie. "My people are staged 2 miles out, 34 riders, final count. Cal is with them." Marcus looked up from his coffee. "Cal Briggs," he said. Victor glanced at him. "You know him?" "I know of him," Marcus said with the tone of someone who has read the chapter on that particular subject and understands its weight. "He's a good man," Victor said. "All of them are." Dale was looking at Victor with the full attention of someone who is revising his understanding of a situation in real time. 34 riders, he said slowly. 34, Victor said. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Sophie. "When that man said he knew your father, he said he wasn't kidding around." "No," Sophie said. "He wasn't." At 6:47, a black SUV turned onto the street that ran in front of Mitchell Classic Garage and slowed to a crawl. Sophie saw it through the waiting room window. She didn't move. Victor was standing near the side door, and she watched his posture change a nearly invisible shift like a cable going taut. "That's the scout," he said quietly. "They're checking the situation before they commit." The SUV moved past without stopping. Victor pulled out his phone and sent a single text. 2 words. Then he put the phone back in his pocket. "They're coming," he said to the room. "Stay inside. Love you. No matter what happens, stay inside." Dale started to say something. "Dale?" Victor said, not harshly. "Please." Dale settled back. 7 minutes passed. Sophie counted them by the clock on the wall, because there was nothing else to do with her hands and her mind required an anchor. At 6:54, she heard the first engine. It was distant at first, a low vibration that she felt before she heard it clearly, the kind of frequency that a person who has spent her life around engines recognizes below the threshold of conscious thought. Then it separated into multiple sources overlapping, building the way a sound builds when it has geometry, when it's coming from more than one direction at once because the thing making the sound has spread itself across more than one road. Then the headlights appeared, not from the main road, from 3 directions simultaneously: the main street, the side street, and the service road behind the garage. 34 motorcycles coordinating their arrival with a precision that spoke to the decades of movement these men had made together, the shared instinct of people who had navigated the same roads in the same formation for so many years that the choreography was unconscious. The sound was enormous, not aggressive, not revving, not performing, just present. 34 engines at idle filling the air around Mitchell Classic Garage, the way water fills a space finding every corner. Sophie stood at the window and felt something happen to her breathing. From behind the garage from the service road, 2 more vehicles came, not motorcycles. A dark truck and a SUV that belonged to Holloway's crew. They had already turned onto the service road before the motorcycles appeared, and now they were stopped, engine running, facing the back of the garage and the line of headlights that had materialized on the road behind them. Victor walked out the front door. Sophie almost followed him. Ray's hand came down gently on her shoulder. "He said to stay," Ray said quietly. She stayed, but she watched through the window with everything she had. Victor walked to the edge of the parking lot and stood there. He didn't look large. He wasn't performing anything. He just stood there the way a fence post stands there, because it's sunk deep enough in the right ground to not need to demonstrate anything. A man stepped out of the lead SUV on the main road. Not one of the original 3 from the break-in. Someone new, heavier, older, with the particular posture of a man who has spent his career delivering messages that people don't want to receive. He looked at Victor. He looked at the motorcycles. He looked at the riders who were seated, engines still running, not one of them making a move. He looked back at Victor. "We're here on behalf of," he started. I know who you're here on behalf of, Victor said. His voice was completely level and carried easily over the engine sound. And I want you to understand something before you take another step in any direction. What you're looking at right now is the short version. The short version is 34 people who drove a combined total of about 800 miles today because a woman named Sophie Mitchell is someone worth driving for. The long version involves phone calls you don't want made and connections you haven't mapped. He paused. Richard Holloway's a businessman. He's smart enough to understand cost benefit. I want you to call him right now from this parking lot and tell him what you're looking at. And then I want you to relay a message from me. The man from the SUV was very still. What message, he said. Tell him the Mitchell property is not available, Victor said. Tell him it was never available. It will never be available. And the next move he makes against it will not be answered by lawyers, and it will not be answered by one phone call. Tell him that the people standing on this road right now are the beginning of the story, not the end, and that the people who come after them are people he genuinely does not want to meet. He let that settle for exactly 3 seconds. And tell him that the right move, the smart move, the move that cost him nothing except this one piece of land is to redirect his development project 30 feet to the east, which his own surveys already show is architecturally viable, and to leave Sophie Mitchell and Mitchell Classic Garage completely and permanently alone. The man from the SUV stood there with his phone in his hand. Behind the garage, the truck in the second SUV had not moved. Their occupants hadn't gotten out. Sophie realized watching from the window that they were waiting, that the appearance of the motorcycles had frozen the operation before it could begin, and that whatever they had come to do tonight, the doing of it had been made categorically impossible without a decision from above. Make the call, Victor said. The man made the call. He walked about 20 feet away and talked for 4 minutes. Sophie watched him from the window, watching the shape of a conversation she couldn't hear, trying to read it from the shifts in his posture, the way his weight moved from one foot to the other, the moment when something the person on the other end said made him turn and look at the motorcycles again with fresh eyes. He came back to Victor. Mr. Holloway would like to know who he's talking to, the man said. He already knows, Victor said. That's why he sent you to make that call instead of ending this conversation immediately. A pause, because he says he'll need time to evaluate the alternative site, the man said. He can have until Monday, Victor said. That's 4 days. It's generous. Another pause, another brief exchange on the phone. He agrees to the evaluation period, the man said carefully. Good, Victor said. I'll hear from his attorney by Monday. If I don't, the conversation we're having right now will expand in scope considerably. He looked at the man with absolute calm. You can go. The man got back in his SUV. The vehicles on the service road reversed and cleared the road. The SUVs on the main street turned around and drove away. And then there was just the sound of 34 engines idling in the dark and the orange glow of headlights across the parking lot of Mitchell, Classic Garage, and Sophie, standing at the waiting room window, with her hand pressed flat against the glass. She walked outside. She walked past Ray and Dale and Tom and Marcus, without saying anything to any of them through the side door and into the parking lot, and she stood there in the cold December air and looked at the road. Victor was already walking back toward her. Behind him, beginning their turnaround one by one, were the motorcycles, not rushing, not performing the departure, just methodically, patiently, the way the men who rode them did everything with the deliberate purpose of people who understand that how you leave somewhere is as important as how you arrive. A man on a large dark motorcycle pulled up close to where Sophie was standing and stopped. He was older than Victor by a few years, big-framed with a gray beard and eyes that had the particular quality of having seen the full range of what people were capable of and having arrived somewhere beyond surprise. He looked at Sophie for a moment. You're Tom's girl, he said. I am, she said. He nodded once slowly. Your dad was a straight-edge shooter, he said. The world needs more straight-edge shooters. He looked at the garage at the sign above the door at the lit windows. You keep this place open, he said. You hear me? You keep it open. Yes, sir, Sophie said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he rode away. She watched every one of them go. It took a few minutes. Nobody rushed. When the last set of taillights disappeared down the main road, the street was completely empty and quiet, and the air smelled like exhaust and cold, and something she couldn't name exactly. Something adjacent to relief, but deeper than that. Victor stood beside her. She didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't either. They stood in the parking lot of Mitchell Classic Garage in the December cold and listened to the town come back to its normal frequency. Cal Briggs told me to keep the shop open, she finally said. He tells everyone that, Victor said, the ones he means it for. She looked at him. Did it work? I think so, he said. Holloway's smart. He ran the calculation while his man was standing there. He knows the development works 30 feet east. He's known for a while. He's been holding out because he's the kind of man who doesn't like being told no. Victor paused. Tonight he got told no in a language he could actually hear. And if he doesn't honor it, if Monday comes and we don't hear from his attorney, Victor looked at her steadily. Then we have a different conversation, he said. But I don't think it comes to that. Why? Because I know men like Richard Holloway, Victor said. They're not irrational. They're just convinced most of the time that they're the most powerful variable in any situation. Tonight he found out he isn't. He paused. Men like that adjust. They don't like adjusting, but they do it. Sophie looked at the garage. At the sign her father had put up in 1989, in the same hand that had labeled every tool hook on that pegboard wall. At the windows that had been lit every single morning for 35 years. At the door that she had opened at 6 a.m. every morning since the night 3 men had come in with crowbars and tried to make her believe this place was already gone. Ray, she said, not turning around. Ray appeared in the doorway. Yeah. Is there food anywhere in this building? I've got a bag of chips and half a box of crackers. Dale, she said. My wife made a lasagna, Dale said from inside. She said to bring it because she had a feeling. Sophie turned around and looked at the 4 of them standing in the doorway of her garage. Ray, with his calloused hands and steady eyes. Dale, with his thermos and his 71 years of showing up. Tom and Marcus, who had come because Dale asked and had stayed without explanation. Go get the lasagna, she said. They ate in the waiting room, all 6 of them, using the coffee table and the windowsill and various other surfaces that were not designed for eating from. And they talked about the things people talk about when the hard part is over and the relief hasn't fully processed yet, and everyone needs the specific comfort of ordinary conversation. Ray talked about his daughter's school play. Dale talked about his truck. Tom Reeves talked about a fishing trip he was planning. Victor drank coffee and listened, and occasionally said something dry and precise that made everyone laugh. Sophie sat in her father's chair. The good one, the one behind the desk, the one she usually avoided because it still felt like his, and ate her lasagna, and looked at these people around her, and thought about what the garage actually was. Not a business, not a building, not a piece of property on a survey line that Richard Holloway needed for the western entrance of his development. It was this room, these people. The version of a place that gets built over 35 years by a man who charges what things cost, and sometimes less, who fixes bikes for traveling strangers, and refuses extra money, who says doing the right thing is payment enough, and then spends his whole life proving he means it. Her father hadn't known when he'd fixed Victor Callahan's chain in the spring of 2004 that he was adding something to a ledger. He hadn't done it for the ledger. He'd done it because that was who he was. The ledger was just the shape that goodness takes when it travels through time. She looked at Victor across the waiting room. He would have liked you, she said. I mean, he did like you, but he would have liked knowing who you really were. Victor held her gaze for a moment. I think he knew, he said quietly. He was that kind of man. He knew who people were. Sophie nodded. She thought about the call that was or wasn't coming on Monday. She thought about Diane Crowell and the 4 pages of legal notes. She thought about the 34 riders who had driven 800 miles combined for a woman they'd never met because a good man had charged a stranger $14 for parts in 2004. She thought about the sign above the door. Mitchell Classic Garage. It was still there. It was going to stay there. She was certain of it now in a way she hadn't been certain of anything since the night the crowbars came in. Not because the fight was over, it wasn't, not officially, not until Monday's call confirmed it, but because she understood something now that she hadn't understood before, something her father had known and Victor had known and Cal Briggs had known without ever needing to articulate it. Goodness was not fragile. It looked fragile. It looked like one woman in a shop that was too small and too old and too easily targeted. but it was connected underground in ways that weren't visible until the moment they needed to be. It was rooted in every favor never asked for repayment, every bill charged at cost, every chain repaired on a rainy afternoon for exact change, plus whatever kindness the moment required. The roots went deep. And when something tried to pull the tree down, the roots held. She finished her lasagna and went to refill her coffee and stood in the doorway of the garage for a moment looking at the bay, at the lifts and the tools and the oil-dark floor and the pegboard wall with her father's handwriting on every label. And she said nothing and needed to say nothing because everything she felt was already fully present in the room around her. Monday would come, she'd answer whatever it brought. But tonight, Mitchell Classic Garage was full of people, and the lasagna was good, and the coffee was hot, and the sign above the door was still there. That was enough. For tonight, that was entirely enough. Monday came the way important days always do, without ceremony, without any change in the quality of the light, or the temperature of the air, or the sound of the town waking up around her. Sophie opened the garage at 6 a.m. exactly as she had every morning for years, and she did it with the same motion, the same key in the same lock, the same particular resistance in the door handle that she'd been meaning to adjust for 2 months. The ordinary texture of things was its own kind of anchor, and she held on to it. Ray was in at 6:30. He didn't ask about Monday. He made coffee and pulled the schedule and started prepping the first bay, and the sound of him working was the most reassuring thing in the building. She had told herself she wouldn't watch the clock. She watched the clock. Diane Crowell had said to expect contact from Holloway's attorney before close of business, which in legal terms meant 5 p.m., which meant Sophie had 11 hours of not knowing. She had learned over the past several weeks that the waiting was its own kind of pressure, different from the supplier calls and the regulatory filings and the sound of crowbars in the dark, more diffuse and harder to push back against, because it didn't have a specific direction to push back from. It was just presence like weather. You worked through it. She worked through it. By past 9 a.m., she had finished a fuel injector cleaning and started a timing belt replacement on a Subaru that belonged to a woman named Ellen Park, who had been coming to the garage for 4 years and who had, during the worst weeks of the supplier crisis, sent 3 of her coworkers over as new customers without being asked. Sophie worked on Ellen Park's car with the specific focus she always brought to timing belts, which were unforgiving in the particular way that a thing is unforgiving. When being wrong about it means an engine destroys itself, and for 45 minutes the world contracted to the width of the job in front of her, and nothing else existed. That was the gift of mechanical work. It had always been the gift. It demanded all of you, and when something demanded all of you, it left no room for the rest. At 10:45, Diane called. Sophie wiped her hands and answered before the second ring. "Have you heard anything?" Sophie said. "Not yet," Diane said. "That's actually why I'm calling. I want you to understand what the silence means and what it doesn't mean. Holloway's attorneys are good at what they do. They'll take as much of the 4 days as they can because time in a negotiation is positioning. The fact that we haven't heard yet is not a signal of anything except that they know how to use a clock." A pause. "But I also want to tell you something I found out this morning." Sophie straightened up. "Tell me." "I have a contact in the county assessor's office," Diane said. "She called me at 8 a.m. There was a survey request filed last Thursday before the confrontation at the garage for the parcels immediately east of your property along the development corridor. Standard preliminary survey. But the filing was through Holloway Development's secondary LLC, not the primary. Sophie processed that. He was already looking at the alternative site. He was already looking at the alternative site, Diane confirmed. Before Victor's message, before the confrontation, before any of this escalation. He had his engineers run the eastern corridor at some point in the past 60 days, and the survey request is evidence that the conclusion was favorable. So he knew all along that his development worked without my property. He knew it was viable, Diane said carefully. Whether it worked as well, whether the corner placement was still optimal, I can't say. But the eastern corridor works. He knew that, which means everything he did to you after the point that survey was commissioned was about something else. Sophie was very still. "About not letting me win," she said. "About not being told no," Diane said. "That's my read. He's a man who's accustomed to getting what he set out to get, and the Mitchell property became less about the development and more about the principle." A pause. That doesn't change where we are today, but it might change how we handle whatever communication comes from his attorneys. Because if he was already planning to move east, the terms of any agreement need to reflect that we know that. Meaning he doesn't get to frame this as him doing us a favor. Correct, Diane said. He was going east regardless. The question is what the documentation around that decision looks like and whether it includes language protecting you from any future approach. Sophie exhaled. What do you need from me? Nothing right now. I'm drafting language for a permanent easement restriction that I'll want his attorneys to include in any agreement. It's a standard instrument. It essentially creates a recorded legal barrier against future acquisition attempts on the Mitchell property by Holloway Development or any of its affiliates for a period of 25 years. She paused. He won't love it. Is it enforceable? Completely, Diane said. And if he's as smart as I think he is, he'll sign it. Because signing it costs him nothing if he was already going east, and refusing it creates a paper record of bad faith that I can use in other contexts. Sophie thought about Richard Holloway on the 14th floor of his building, looking out at the city and running his calculations. He'll sign it, she said. I think so too, Diane said. But I wanted you to hear the reasoning. Duh. The call from Holloway's attorney came at 3:58 p.m., 2 minutes before 4. Not close of business. Still within Monday, but with enough margin to avoid looking like they'd cut it to the wire, which was itself a communication, a deliberate signal of control over the timing. Sophie was under a Ford Explorer when Ray came to get her, crouching down to say quietly, "Phone call, Diane Crowell's office, line 2. She slid out, wiped her hands, picked up the shop phone. Diane was already on the line. "Sophie, I'm here with Holloway's lead counsel, a Mr. Patterson. He's got a proposal. I'd like you to listen and let me handle the response, but I wanted you present." "I'm here," Sophie said. Patterson's voice was the professional neutral of someone who had delivered 1,000 proposals that were actually Bailey's capitulations without ever allowing the word capitulation to enter the conversation. He outlined Holloway Development's decision to relocate the western corridor of the Red Valley luxury project to the eastern alignment, citing recent survey results and architectural consultation. He used words like strategic refinement and project optimization. He did not use words like "we backed down" or "you won." When he finished, Diane said, "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Before we discuss terms, I want to confirm that we're including a permanent easement restriction against future acquisition attempts on the Mitchell property by Holloway Development and its affiliates, 25-year term recorded with the county." A pause on Patterson's end, not long. "That's a non-standard element," he said. "It's a standard instrument," Diane said pleasantly. "We'd simply like it recorded." Another pause. Sophie heard paper moving. "I'll need to confirm with my client." "Of course," Diane said. "I'll expect your confirmation by 10 a.m. tomorrow." Patterson said he'd be in touch. The call ended. Diane came back on the line alone. "That pause when I mentioned the easement," she said. "That was him calculating whether the fight was worth it." "It's not. He'll confirm tomorrow." "You're certain?" 90%, Diane said. "The other 10% is me being professionally cautious. But yes, he's going east, Sophie. It's over." Sophie stood at her father's desk with the shop phone in her hand and the garage running behind her, Ray working the Subaru on the lift, the ordinary sounds of work happening in the space her father had built 35 years ago. And she said, okay, because there wasn't a bigger word available for what she was feeling. "Get some sleep tonight," Diane said. "Tomorrow we finish it." Well, she didn't sleep. Not badly, not anxiously. She just didn't sleep the way a person doesn't sleep when something is almost resolved and the almost is doing all the work. She lay in the dark and thought about the progression of the past 4 months, from the first moment the tall man with the crowbar had walked through her front door to the sound of 34 motorcycle engines idling in the cold. And she tried to find the moment where the story had turned, the precise hinge point where losing had become not losing. She couldn't find it. It hadn't been one moment. It had been 100 small ones strung together by stubbornness and other people's loyalty and the long tail of her father's simple decency. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleeping and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and called Victor. He answered immediately. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you," she said. "I don't need as much sleep as I used to," he said. One of the few advantages. She told him about the call, about Diane's reading of it, about the easement restriction. He listened without interrupting. Good, he said when she finished. That's all good. What else should I say, he said. It went the way it should go. Diane is sharp. The easement was the right move. Diane said she's known you 15 years. About that, he said. She said you don't say things you don't mean. Also true, he said. Sophie wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Victor, when this is done, when the paperwork is signed and Holloway is pointed east and everything is settled, what happens to you? A pause. What do you mean? I mean, you came to Red Valley 9 years ago to be somewhere quiet, she said. You came here to be done with the life you had before. And then I've pulled you back into it, made calls, brought people in, used all of it. Does that cost you something I don't understand? Victor was quiet for long enough that she could hear the particular texture of a thoughtful silence. It's a fair question, he said. The answer is no. Using what I know to help someone who deserves help is not the same as going back to the life I left. The life I left was, he paused. There were things I was part of that I'm not proud of. But there were also 30 years of brotherhood and loyalty in the particular code that comes with that. I didn't leave because the code was wrong. I left because I was done with the costs. He paused again. What happened this week had no costs I didn't choose freely. And Cal and Reyes and 34 people who drove 800 miles. They chose freely too, Victor said. That's the thing about people who actually believe in something. They don't need to be convinced to act when the moment calls for it. They just need to be told what the moment is. Sophie looked at the kitchen wall, her father's old Colorado Rockies calendar. 3 years outdated, still hanging because she kept forgetting to take it down. A magnet from a place she'd never been. A hook where her keys lived. The entirely ordinary furniture of a life being lived. He would have liked knowing you were here, she said again. It was the second time she'd said it, and she meant it just as much the second time. Go to sleep, Sophie, Victor said, not unkindly. Tomorrow you sign papers. She almost smiled. Good night, Victor. Good night. Patterson's confirmation came at 9:43 a.m., 17 minutes before Diane's deadline. The easement was in. Diane called Sophie at 10:15 to read her the key language, the specific phrases that would be recorded with the county and would stand for 25 years as a legal barrier between Holloway Development and Mitchell Classic Garage. Sophie listened to the words, their formal, precise, irrevocable quality, and thought about the 3 months of fear and exhaustion, and the night with the crowbars and the supplier calls, and the rumor that the shop was closing. And she thought about all of it being answered ultimately by a paragraph in a county record that said no clearly and permanently in a language that needed no translation. We signed Thursday, Diane said. Holloway's office. He'll send Patterson, not come himself, but the signatures are the signatures. Will it actually hold? Sophie said. 25 years is a long time. What happens if he finds a way around it? He doesn't find a way around it, Diane said flatly. That's why we're recording it. It attaches to the property title. Any future owner, any affiliate, any entity with Holloway in its corporate structure bound by it. His attorneys know this. They signed off on it, which means they've already accepted it. A pause. Sophie, it's done. I know it doesn't feel entirely real yet. That's normal, but it's done. Sophie sat with that. Thank you, she finally said. Stop thanking me, Diane said. I did my job, which I enjoyed thoroughly, by the way. Patterson is very good at what he does, and it was a genuinely satisfying process. A dry pause. Tell Victor I said so. She told Victor when he came in on Friday. He was back on his regular schedule Friday afternoon. The shovelhead, the coffee, the outdoor magazine he'd already read. Except this time he didn't pretend to read the magazine. He sat across from Sophie in the waiting room, and she told him about the signing, about the recorded easement, about Patterson's exact expression when Diane read the final language back into the record for confirmation. What did he look like? Victor said. Like a man who had just eaten something slightly unpleasant and decided it was better than the alternative, Sophie said. Victor laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it was the first time she'd heard him laugh like that. It changed his whole face, took 20 years off the lines around his eyes, and she saw for a moment the younger man he must have been before decades of a particular kind of life had settled into those features. That's Patterson, he said. That is an exact description of Patterson. How do you know Patterson? He represented some of Cal's associates about 12 years ago, Victor said. He's good. He just doesn't enjoy losing. Diane didn't give him much choice. No, Victor said. She rarely does. The waiting room was quiet around them. The garage was running. Ray had 2 cars in the bay and the radio on some classic rock station he liked that Sophie had given up trying to change. Outside, Red Valley was doing what it did on a cold Friday afternoon in December, which was not much, but doing it with a kind of settled contentment that Sophie had always found reassuring about the town. There's something I haven't told you, Victor said. Sophie set down her coffee. Okay. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it for a moment, and she had the impression of a man doing something he had been turning over in his mind for a while, something he'd decided was necessary but hadn't looked forward to. He handed it to her. She unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten, not typed on plain white paper. The handwriting was familiar before she understood why, and then she understood why because it was the same hand that had labeled every tool hook on the pegboard wall, the same slightly left-leaning print she had read on receipts and notes and labels her entire life. It was her father's handwriting. She looked up at Victor. He wrote it the last time I saw him, Victor said quietly. We had coffee in the shop after closing. That was about 6 months before he passed. He'd been sick for a while and he knew where things were going, and he was the kind of man who didn't leave things unsaid when he had the chance to be them. A pause, Law. He asked me to give it to you when you needed it and not before. He didn't want you reading it when things were easy. He wanted you to have it when things were hard. Sophie looked down at the letter. Her father's voice came off the page the way his voice always had, direct, uncluttered, slightly formal in writing the way he never was in person. He had written about the garage, about what he hoped for it, about what he believed she was capable of that she didn't yet believe about herself. He had written about the fights that would come because he had known they would come, because he was a man who understood that things worth keeping were worth fighting for, and that the fighting would find her whether she looked for it or not. Near the end, he had written, "You will not be alone, even when it feels that way. I have put people in the world who owe this family something, and some of them will know when to show up. Don't be too proud to let them." And at the very bottom, in the same print as everything else, he had written her name. And then the garage was never just a building. You already know what it is. Trust what you know. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along the original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. He knew you'd come, she said. I don't know if he knew specifically, Victor said. I think he knew that whatever help showed up would show up. He was specific enough to ask me to hold the letter, but the rest of it, I think he just trusted the general principle. He trusted that the people he'd been good to would be good back. Yes, Victor said. Sophie turned the folded letter over in her hands. That's a lot of faith in people. He earned the faith, Victor said. That's how faith works, the real kind. You don't manufacture it. You build it over 30 years of charging people what things cost, and sometimes less, and then it's just there in the accounts waiting. She looked at him. You're more like him than you know, she said. Victor accepted that without comment, but something moved behind his eyes that she recognized now. The thing he didn't say when he could have the quiet management of an emotion that he'd decided was his to hold rather than perform. I'm going to get this framed, she said, holding up the letter. He'd roll his eyes at that, Victor said. Probably, she said, but he's not here to argue about it. The news about Richard Holloway broke on a Wednesday morning in late January, which was 6 weeks after the signing and 3 weeks after the easement had been officially recorded with the county. It came from a state-level investigative piece in the Denver Post, the kind of story that has months of reporting behind it and lands fully formed on a Wednesday morning and does not ask anyone's permission. The reporter had talked to 7 former business owners across 3 counties who had experienced variations of what Holloway had done to Sophie, the supplier pressure, the regulatory filings, the rumors, the more physical demonstrations of seriousness in 2 of the 7 cases. The piece documented a pattern that went back 11 years, a playbook that Holloway Development had used on properties it wanted and found resistant to normal acquisition. Sophie read the article at her father's desk at 7 a.m. with a coffee going cold beside her. She read it 3 times. She called Diane. I saw it, Diane said before Sophie could speak. I'm not surprised. I had a sense there was more organized documentation out there. I may have passed some of what we compiled to a person who knows a reporter. Sophie blinked. You may have. This is a conversation I'm not having on a recorded line, Diane said pleasantly. But yes, the pattern of what Holloway did to you fit a profile I recognize from other situations. The documentation we assembled was very good. I thought someone with a byline might find it useful. Diane, Sophie said, yes. You are, Sophie paused, searching for the right word. You are extraordinarily effective. I know, Diane said. It's been noted before. A pause. The article is going to generate some momentum. The state AG's office has been aware of Holloway for a while. This gives them the public framework they needed. I expect there will be a formal investigation announced within the month. Is he going to come after me for cooperating? He has nothing to come after you with, Diane said. Everything you did was legal, documented, and defensible, and the easement is recorded. He can't touch you. A pause. Besides, he has considerably larger problems this morning. Victor called at 9 a.m. You saw the article, he said. I saw the article, she said. Diane's involved. I figured she was, he said. She mentioned something to me 3 weeks ago that I interpreted to mean she was building something. I didn't ask specifics. Should I be concerned? Sophie said. No, Victor said. You documented everything. You cooperated legally with everything. You're on the right side of every line. A pause. Other people who weren't as lucky as you, the ones who didn't have the support system when Holloway came for them, they're the ones whose stories are in that article. This is their justice as much as yours. Sophie thought about that, about the 7 names in the article, the 7 small businesses, the 7 versions of the same pressure campaign applied in the same methodical way, and how many of those had ended differently than hers because no one had been watching from across the street. How many of them closed, she said. 4, Victor said. 3 are still open. The 3 that are still open, were they just tougher? Some, Victor said, but mostly they had someone, a spouse who had resources, or a landlord who pushed back, or a family member with legal knowledge. The ones that closed were the ones who were alone. A pause. You weren't alone. That was the difference. Sophie looked at the window. Outside, the parking lot was filling up. Dale Whitmore's truck, a car she recognized as belonging to Carol Bridges. 2 vehicles she didn't immediately place. Full morning. Normal morning. I want to call the 3 that are still open, she said. Victor paused. What do you mean, the 3 businesses in the article that survived? She said. I want to call them. I want to tell them what happened here and what worked and what I learned. And I want to find out if there's something I can do for the 4 that closed. She paused. I'm not going to be the person who got the help and then just went back to being alone and fine. A silence. A particular kind of silence, the kind Victor produced when something had moved him, and he was deciding how much of that to show. Tom would be proud of that, he said. Don't tell me what he would think, she said, not harshly. It'll make me cry and I have a full bay. Victor made a sound that was almost certainly a laugh kept carefully in check. I'll let you get to work, he said. Victor. Yeah. Thank you, she said. For the last time, because you hate it when I say it and I know that, but this is the last time and it needs to be said. Another silence. Shorter. You're welcome, he said. For the last time. The calls she made to the other businesses took 3 weeks. It wasn't a simple thing. 2 of the surviving 3 were initially cautious about talking to someone they'd never met who called out of the blue, claiming a similar experience. And Sophie understood that caution completely because she'd learned in the past several months what it felt like to not know who was on whose side. She was patient. She was honest about who she was and what had happened to her and how it had resolved. She didn't oversell the resolution or make it sound easier than it had been. The first business, a family-owned hardware store in Montrose, took 2 calls and an email before the owner, a woman named Barb Kowalski, who had the voice of someone who had been through the specific furnace that suspicion of other people's motives had built, decided Sophie was real, and the conversation was worth having. They talked for 90 minutes. Barb's situation had been different in the details. Holloway had come through a zoning challenge rather than a physical demonstration, but the shape of it was identical. The same slow suffocation, the same methodical removal of support. I stayed open, Barb said, but I lost 2 years of growth, 2 years of customers. I should have had 2 years of expansion I was ready for before the filing started. I got through it, but I got through it smaller. I'm sorry, Sophie said. What do you want from me? Barb said. Not rudely, just directly. She had the directness of someone who had stopped wasting time. Nothing, Sophie said. I want to know if there's anything useful that happened on your end. Documents, contacts, anything Diane Crowell might be able to use. And I want you to know that there's a legal instrument that's being prepared for a class of cases like ours, and Diane would like to talk to you if you're willing. A pause. Who's Diane Crowell? Barb said. She's the lawyer who got a 25-year easement out of Richard Holloway's attorney and then fed the documentation to the Denver Post. Sophie said. A much longer pause. Give me her number, Barb said. The formal investigation was announced by the state AG's office on a Tuesday in mid-February, 6 weeks after the Denver Post piece, and 3 months after the night 34 motorcycles had surrounded Mitchell Classic Garage in the dark. Sophie heard about it from Ray, who had it from his daughter who had seen it on the news. Ray came into the office while she was doing billing and set his phone down on the desk with the article open. She read the headline. She set the phone back down. You okay? Ray said. Yes, she said. You don't look like it. I'm fine, she said. She stopped. When something you've been fighting against finally has consequences, it doesn't feel the way you think it's going to feel. Ray looked at her carefully. He had known her long enough to know when to push and when not to. How does it feel? He said. She thought about it honestly. Quiet, she said. It feels quiet, like a noise you'd been living with long enough to stop hearing it had finally stopped. Ray nodded slowly. That's how my dad described coming home from Vietnam, he said. He said the first night there was no artillery, he couldn't sleep because it was too quiet. Sophie looked at him. Did it get easier? He said after about a week he started sleeping through the night again, Ray said. Because quiet stopped being the absence of something and started being just quiet. She picked up the phone and called Victor. Did you see it? She said. I saw it, he said. How do you feel? A pause, the particular textured pause of Victor Callahan thinking something through before he said it, which she had come to recognize as one of his most reliable qualities. Like something that should have happened a long time ago is happening now, he said. And like Tom Mitchell fixed a chain on a highway in 2004, and the ripples from that are still moving. Ripples, she said. Everything has ripples, Victor said. Most of them you never see. Occasionally you get to see one. Sophie looked at the window. Parking lot, normal Tuesday. Cars coming and going, people with normal problems that needed normal solutions, engines that needed what engines always needed. Everything exactly as it was supposed to be. I'm going to expand the shop, she said, a beat. Tell me, Victor said. The bay next door has been vacant for 18 months, she said. I've been in conversation with the landlord. If I take it, I can add 2 lifts and bring on another mechanic, which means I can take larger jobs and not have to turn away the commercial fleet accounts that have been calling since the article ran. She paused. The math works. I ran it with Dale's accountant last week. It works. When did you start talking to the landlord? Victor said. About 3 weeks ago, she said, before the AG announcement. I didn't want to wait for things to be settled to start building the next thing. Dad always said you don't wait for permission to grow. A silence. No, Victor said quietly. He didn't. I'm going to need someone to help me assess the new bay's equipment layout, she said. The electrical is old, and I want a second opinion on the lift placements before I commit to anything. I'll come Friday, Victor said. I know, she said. That's why I told you on a Tuesday. He made the sound again, the barely contained laugh. You are exactly like him, he said. I'll take that, Sophie said. She hung up the phone and sat for a moment at her father's desk in her father's chair with her father's letter framed on the wall where the calendar used to be. The framing had been Ray's idea, done quietly while she was at the county building for the signing. The letter mounted on a simple off-white mat in a plain, dark frame, hung at eye level to the right of the door so you saw it when you came in and when you went out. She looked at it. You will not be alone, even when it feels that way. She hadn't been. She wasn't. She picked up the phone and called Barb Kowalski in Montrose because there was a conversation she'd been meaning to follow up on, and Barb deserved to hear about the AG announcement from someone who understood exactly what it meant. And because the work of not letting people stand alone was not something you did once and then filed away. It was something you kept doing, the way you kept opening the doors at 6 a.m., the way you kept answering the phone, the way you kept doing the work that was in front of you on any given morning in any given life. The phone rang twice. Barb picked up. "It's Sophie Mitchell," she said. "Did you see the announcement?" "I saw it," Barb said. Her voice was different from the first call, less guarded. "I've been sitting here for an hour thinking about calling you." "Tell me what you're thinking," Sophie said. And Barb did. Barb Kowalski drove up from Montrose on a Thursday morning in early March, arriving at Mitchell Classic Garage at 9:45 in a white Dodge pickup that had seen considerable use and had not been apologized for. She was 53, built sturdy in the way of someone who had spent her adult life moving hardware and lifting things with gray threading through dark hair. She kept pulled back in the specific kind of eyes that had done a lot of evaluating and had gotten good at it. Sophie met her in the parking lot. They shook hands, and in that handshake was the compressed weight of 2 phone calls and 6 weeks of parallel experience, and neither of them needed to say much about any of it because they'd already said it, and the important thing now was what came next. "Nice place," Barb said, looking at the garage. 35 years old, Sophie said. "Some days it shows. Come inside." Ray had coffee ready. He had also, without being asked, cleared the waiting room of its usual clutter and set up Sophie's father's old fold-out table with chairs on both sides because Ray understood what kind of meeting this was, even without a full briefing. Sophie had long since stopped being surprised by his instinct for the shape of his situation. She had just started being grateful for it more openly. Barb sat down, wrapped her hands around her mug and said, "I talked to the other 2, the other surviving businesses. They'll come in by phone if you want, but Clara's in Grand Junction and moving her whole operation during March is asking a lot." "Phone is fine," Sophie said. "What about the 4 that closed?" Barb's expression shifted just slightly. "Not grief exactly. The post-grief version of grief, the thing that remains after you've processed the main event, and what's left is the permanent texture of knowing. 2 of them are open to talking," she said. "The other 2, one moved out of state completely. The other one, I think, just doesn't want to revisit it. I understand that." "I do." "I understand it too," Sophie said. "I'm not going to push anyone." "The 2 who will talk," Barb said, "are angry, good and angry, the kind of angry that's been sitting in a box since Holloway ran over them, and now there's an AG investigation and the box has a reason to be opened." She paused. "Their testimony is going to be useful." "Diane thinks so too," Sophie said. "She's building a supplemental file for the AG's office. Everything documented, everything timestamped, the full pattern, laid out across all 7 cases." She looked at Barb. "Your records from Montrose, the zoning filings, the response documentation, she says they're clean." "I kept everything," Barb said flatly. "From day one. My mother always said document everything because the world will lie about what happened and paper doesn't lie." "Smart woman," Sophie said. "She owned a dry cleaning business for 40 years, Barb said. She knew." They talked for 2 hours, going through the structure of what Diane was building, the categories of evidence, the question of whether any of the 7 would be willing to submit formal affidavits to support the investigation. Barb was organized and direct and had brought her own folder of documents, tabbed and labeled, which she laid out on the table with the efficiency of someone who had been quietly preparing for exactly this meeting since the Denver Post piece ran. At a certain point, Sophie said, "Why did you come in person? You could have sent the documents." Barb looked at her. "Because I wanted to see if you were real," she said. "On the phone, you sounded real, but I've had people sound real on the phone before and then be something different in person." She paused. "You're real." Sophie held her gaze. "So are you," she said. Barb almost smiled. It was a small smile, not fully deployed, the kind that lives at the corner of a mouth when someone is not yet ready to feel entirely okay about something, but is getting closer. "Your father built this place," she said. "He built it, and I inherited it," Sophie said. "And then I fought for it, which I think is the natural order of things." "It is," Barb said. She looked around the waiting room at the coffee maker and the magazines and the framed letter on the wall. Her gaze stopped there. "What's that? My father wrote it," Sophie said. "He gave it to an old friend to hold for me until I needed it." Barb was quiet for a moment. "And you needed it?" "Badly," Sophie said. Barb looked at the letter for another second, then back at Sophie. "Mine died when I was 31, she said. "My dad?" "Heart attack. He never saw the hardware store. I built it after." She paused. "Sometimes I wonder what he'd think." "He'd think you're a straight shooter." Sophie said. Barb looked at her. That seems to be the highest compliment in this circle, Sophie said. And Barb laughed. A real one, full and unexpected, the kind that catches a person off guard and comes out bigger than they intended. And Sophie laughed too, and the waiting room of Mitchell Classic Garage held that sound for a moment, carried it the way old rooms carry sound, when the walls have absorbed enough of it over the years to know what to do with it. Victor came in on Friday as always. He noticed the fold-out table still in the waiting room, noticed the 2 coffee mugs that had become 3 as the morning had progressed, noticed the organized file folders that Sophie had stacked on the corner of her father's desk. He didn't ask. He sat down, accepted his coffee, and waited, which was his way of inviting conversation without demanding it. Barb Kowalski was here yesterday, Sophie said. How was she? Formidable, Sophie said. She brought a tabbed folder. High praise from you, Victor said. The highest, Sophie said. She leaned back in her chair. Diane has enough now. She called me this morning. The supplemental file goes to the AG's office on Monday. 7 businesses, 11 years of documented pattern, cross-referenced timelines, witness affidavits from 5 of the 7. She paused. She said it's the cleanest package she's ever assembled. Her words. Victor drank his coffee. And the new bay, he said. Signed the lease Tuesday, Sophie said. Ray's brother-in-law is doing the electrical work. We're looking at 8 weeks before we can take the first car in there. But I've already got 3 fleet accounts that have been waiting. You hired a new mechanic. I'm interviewing next week, she said. I've got 2 good candidates. One is 24 years old and just finished her certification at the tech school in Denver, which I find extremely compelling. The other is a retired dealership tech who wants to go back to independent work and knows more about German engines than anyone I've ever talked to, she paused. I'm probably hiring both. Victor looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she had learned over months of learning him to read, as close to pride as he typically got, which was a subdued expression that lived in the stillness of his face rather than in any mobile feature. You're building something, he said. I'm doing what the garage always wanted to do, she said. My dad kept it small because he liked small. He liked knowing every customer. I like that too. But the expansion is right next door, and the new mechanic will be the 3rd person I've ever hired in 6 years, so small is relative. She looked at the window. I keep asking myself whether he'd think I was changing it too much. What do you conclude? Victor said. I conclude that he would have complicated feelings about it, and then he would tell me to trust what I know and stop asking hypothetical questions, she said. Victor nodded. Accurate, he said. Victor, she said. Yeah. Are you staying in Red Valley? He held his coffee mug, looked at the table. For now, he said. That's not a full answer. No, he said. It's not. He set the mug down. I'm not a person who makes long-term declarations. I never have been. I know where I am, and I know where I'm not going, and right now where I am is here. He paused. This garage has become part of my week in a way that it wasn't before, in a way that's different from how it was when I was watching from a distance. That matters to me. I'm not in the habit of walking away from things that matter. Sophie looked at him. My dad said you argued with his generosity every time. I did, Victor said. You lost every time. I know, he said. You're losing this one too, she said. Just so you know. He picked up the outdoor magazine from the stack and opened it to a page he'd read twice already. I'm aware, he said. So, the 35th anniversary of Mitchell Classic Garage fell on a Saturday in April. Sophie hadn't planned anything, or rather, she had planned not to plan anything because the instinct towards ceremony made her uncomfortable in the way it had always made her father uncomfortable, and she had inherited that, along with the lease and the pegboard wall, and the outdated Rocky Mountain Rockies calendar she still hadn't taken down. What happened instead was that people decided for her. Dale Whitmore showed up at 7 a.m. with his wife Patricia in a pan of cinnamon rolls. He did not announce that he was doing this. He just appeared, and Patricia set the rolls on the same fold-out table that had hosted the Barb Kowalski meeting, and Dale poured himself a coffee and sat down like a man who has decided he belongs somewhere and is acting accordingly. Carol Bridges came at 8:30 with 2 of her co-workers from the school district office where she worked women. Sophie didn't know. but who had heard the story somehow through the particular telegraph of a small town where news moves in the specific frequency of things people care about. They brought flowers which Sophie put in an oil can because there were no vases in the garage, and the oil can on the counter looked so right that she couldn't imagine it any other way. Ray came in at his normal time and immediately began making more coffee because Ray's response to any gathering of more than 4 people was to make coffee, which was both pragmatic and deeply kind. Tom and Marcus Reeves came at 9. Marcus brought his girlfriend who had heard about the night in December from Marcus and had told Marcus she wanted to see the place, and she walked through the garage with the particular attention of someone who was imagining an event they weren't present for and finding it more substantial than they expected. Ellen Park brought her Civic in for an oil change and stayed for 2 hours. Gary Tillman, the man who had called during the rumor campaign and rescheduled his appointment, came in and shook Sophie's hand and said without preamble, "I should have believed you the first time," which she accepted without making him feel worse about it. By 11 o'clock, the waiting room in the parking lot held more people than Mitchell Classic Garage had held at any one time in Sophie's memory. She stood in the middle of it and thought about her father standing in this same space 35 years ago for the first time. He had been 31 years old. He had rented this building on a handshake and a deposit that had taken him 2 years to save, and he had opened the doors and waited to see if anyone would come, and they had, because that is what happens when you do things right for long enough. She wasn't 31. She was 29, and she had done nothing but fight for the past 4 months, and the garage was still here, and the doors were open, and the parking lot was full of people who had decided collectively and in their own ways that this place was worth driving for. She thought she understood finally what her father had been building all along. Not a garage, not a business. The thing underneath those things, the thing that a business becomes when it is run the right way for long enough. The web of mutual regard, the accumulated weight of favors given and problems solved and dignity extended across 35 years to every person who walked through that door. The community that forms around a place when the place earns it. She understood it, and it undid her just slightly. Just for a moment, standing in the middle of her parking lot on a Saturday morning in April, with cinnamon rolls on the fold-out table and flowers in an oil can. Victor arrived at 11:15. He came on the shovel head and parked at the far edge of the lot and sat there for a moment before getting off, looking at the crowd of people assessing the situation with the particular thoroughness she had come to know as his default mode. Then he got off the bike and walked through the parking lot, and people moved aside naturally, not deferentially, but with the specific awareness that accompanies a person who carries a certain kind of weight without advertising it. He found Sophie near the garage bay door. "You said you weren't doing anything for the anniversary," he said. "I wasn't," she said. "They did it." He looked at the parking lot, at Dale and Patricia, at Ray moving through the crowd with a coffee pot, at Marcus and his girlfriend, at the flowers in the oil can visible through the window. "Tom would be standing exactly where you're standing," he said, with exactly that expression on his face. "What expression?" "The one where you're trying not to show how much it means," Victor said. She didn't deny it. "He would have told everyone it was too much fuss," she said. "He would have told everyone it was too much fuss and then stayed until the last person left," Victor said, "because that's who he was." She was quiet for a moment. "Diane called this morning," she said. "The AG's office confirmed they've opened a formal investigation. She said they thanked her for the supplemental file. She said the investigator who called her used the phrase remarkably well organized twice." Victor's mouth moved. That would please her considerably. "She said to tell you," Sophie said. "So I'm telling you." He nodded, then quietly, "Are you okay?" It was the simplest question he had ever asked her, and somehow the one that required the most honesty. She stood with it for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved, not reaching for the reflexive answer. "Yes," she said, "I am. I'm tired and I'm happy, and I'm scared about the expansion in the way you're always scared when you commit to something that matters, and She stopped. Started again. "I'm grateful in a way that doesn't have a clean word for it. Grateful for things that happened before I was born. Grateful for a father who was good to people. He didn't have to be good to. Grateful that being good to people turns out to be a strategy that actually works, even when it takes a long time and hurts in the middle." She looked at him. "I'm okay. I'm more than okay." Victor nodded, then good. One word, But the way he said it, the completeness of it, the way it closed a door that had been standing open since the night he stood in her garage and said the situation has changed, meant everything it needed to mean. Cal Briggs called that afternoon. Sophie was back inside by then, sitting at her father's desk while the crowd thinned gradually, and Ray handled the last 3 customers of the day, and Dale's wife Patricia washed coffee mugs in the small sink in the break room, because Patricia was the kind of woman who didn't leave dishes. The number was one she didn't recognize. She answered anyway. "Mitchell Classic Garage," Cal said. "This is Sophie Mitchell," she said. "Cal Briggs," he said. "Flagstaff." She sat up straighter without meaning to. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I'm glad you called." "Don't make it formal," he said. "Just wanted to check in. Heard from Victor, it's the anniversary today." 35 years, she said. "Good number," he said. "Your dad opened this place the year I started writing." "Didn't know that until Victor told me." A pause. "How's the shop?" "Full," she said. "We had a parking lot full of people this morning." "That's how it should be," Cal said. "Mr. Briggs, Cal," she said. "I never got to thank you properly. What you did in December, what all of you did." "Don't," Cal said, not rudely. "Your dad fixed my exhaust pipe in 2007. Wouldn't take labor. Talked to me for 20 minutes about the road I was riding and treated me like a person worth talking to. Some people do that automatically. Most people don't." A pause. 34 people drove because he was that kind of man. The garage is still open because he built the kind of place that deserves to stay open. We just showed up. He did the work. A short silence. "You keep doing the work, Sophie Mitchell." "Yes, sir," she said. He hung up. She held the phone for a moment. Then she put it down and picked up the framed letter from where it lived on the wall, took it down, held it in both hands and read it again, the way she had read it a dozen times since Victor gave it to her. Not because she'd forgotten the words, but because the words meant something slightly different every time, the way a good song means something different depending on when you hear it. You will not be alone even when it feels that way. She hung it back on the wall. She went out to help Ray close up. The expansion bay opened on a Wednesday morning in June, 8 weeks and 3 days after the lease was signed, slightly ahead of the schedule Sophie had set, and exactly on the schedule Ray had privately bet himself it would hit, because he knew how Sophie ran a timeline. The new mechanic was Jesse Varela, 24 years old, certification from the Denver Tech School, with the highest practical score in her graduating class, who had come to the interview with a question list of her own and had asked about the shop's diagnostic equipment and warranty procedures with the precision of someone who had researched the business before showing up and had formed genuine opinions. Sophie had offered her the job before the interview was over. Jesse had asked for 24 hours to think about it. She had called back in 6. The retired dealership tech, a man named George Pham, who had spent 22 years specializing in BMW and Mercedes engines at a luxury dealership in Denver, came on part-time, 3 days a week, which was exactly what he wanted and exactly what the fleet accounts needed, because 2 of the 3 commercial fleet contacts Sophie had signed were moving toward European model vehicles, and George Pham looked at a diesel Mercedes the way Sophie looked at a transmission job, with the particular focused pleasure of someone doing exactly the work they were built for. Ray watched Jessie work on her 3rd day and came to find Sophie in the office. "She's going to be better than me in 2 years, he said. "I know," Sophie said. "I'm not sure how I feel about that," he said. "How do you feel about it?" she said. He thought about it, like Tom felt the first time he watched you diagnose an engine on your own, he said, proud, slightly terrified, mostly proud. Sophie looked at him. Ray Gutierrez had worked for her father for 9 years and for her for 6, and had taken a job at the dealership service center and come back without being asked, and had washed cars and handled customers and talked down 2 separate panicking owners at the side of the road at 7 a.m. in situations that were not in any job description anywhere. She thought about what kind of loyalty that was, the quiet, unstated, permanent kind that didn't require recognition to persist. "You're getting a raise," she said. "I'm not looking for a raise," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why you're getting one." In July, Diane Crowell called with news from the AG's investigation. Richard Holloway had agreed to a consent decree, a formal legal agreement entered into the public record, in which Holloway Development acknowledged specific business conduct violations and agreed to a supervised compliance period of 3 years mandatory restitution payments to 5 of the 7 affected businesses, and a permanent prohibition against certain acquisition tactics within the state of Colorado. Diane laid it out in her precise, dry way, reading the key provisions in the tone of someone who has won something significant and is allowing themselves one degree of satisfaction above their usual professional baseline. When she finished, Sophie said, "The restitution, is it enough?" "Not really," Diane said. "It never is, but it's real and it's documented and it's on the public record, which means anyone who types Richard Holloway's name into a search engine from this point forward is going to find this consent decree before they find his development portfolio." A pause. "That matters. Bimers. For the businesses that had to close, for the owners who lost years, no dollar amount covers that. But the record matters." "What does he have to say about it?" "His attorney issued a statement," Diane said. "Standard language about cooperating with the investigation and remaining committed to responsible development. Patterson wrote it, I'm sure. It's clean." A pause. "But Richard Holloway is not going to try this in Colorado again. And his peers in the development community have noticed. That tends to travel." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Barb Kowalski gets restitution. Barb Kowalski gets the largest payment of the 7, Diane said. "I negotiated her provision personally. She had the best documentation." "A beat. Almost as good as yours." "She learned from her mother," Sophie said. "Her mother was a wise woman," Diane said. "I'll have the full documents to you by end of week. There's nothing that requires your action. You're not a party to the decree. You're a party to the easement, which is separately recorded and separately stands. But I wanted you to hear it from me." "Diane," Sophie said. "Yes." "What do I owe you?" "Ah." A pause. "The kind that carries something personal." "You don't owe me anything," Diane said. "Victor referred you to me. I don't charge Victor's referrals." "You can't operate a law practice on that principle," Sophie said. "I've operated on stranger principles," Diane said. "Besides, this was the most satisfying 3 months of work I've had in 5 years. Patterson and I will go back and forth at Bar Association events for a decade over this. It's going to be extremely enjoyable." Another beat. "Take care of your garage, Sophie, and send me the good mechanic's name, the 24-year-old. I want to know who to call if I ever need someone in Red Valley." Sophie smiled. "Jessie Varela," she said. "She's going to be the best in the valley in 3 years." "Noted," Diane said. "Take care of yourself." Victor came in on the last Friday of July, which was a hot day, the kind of Colorado summer day that feels borrowed from a hotter climate and doesn't quite apologize for it. He came in later than usual, closer to 4 than 2, and Sophie was doing paperwork at her father's desk when she heard the shovelhead in the lot. He came in and stood in the doorway of the office for a moment. Something in the way he was standing told her immediately. Not bad news, not crisis, something quieter than either. The particular posture of a man who has made a decision and arrived to deliver it in person because it deserved to be said face to face. "You're going," she said. He looked at her. "For a while," he said. "Cal wants me to ride out to the coast with him. I haven't done a long run in 4 years. He says I'm getting stiff." "Are you, probably," he said. She set down her pen. "How long?" 8-10 weeks, he said. "Maybe less. I don't have a firm turnaround." He paused. "The shop is in good shape. You've got Ray and Jesse and George. The easement is recorded. The investigation is resolved. Barb Kowalski has your number." He looked at her steadily. "You don't need me here." "I know," she said. "That's not the same as not wanting you here." "No," he said, "it's not." She stood up. She was not a person who cried easily, had not been since childhood, had learned from her father that emotion was real and could be held without being performed, and she was holding it now in the way she'd been taught, fully, without minimizing it, but without making it into a scene that would embarrass them both. "You'll come back," she said. It was not a question. "I'll come back," he said. "Red Valley is where I live. That hasn't changed. And you'll come in on Fridays when you're here." "Same as always," he said. She walked around the desk and stood in front of him. This man who had sat across the street in the dark watching her fight for her father's garage, who had held a letter for the right moment, who had made one phone call that brought 34 people to a parking lot in December, who had known her father and kept that knowledge quietly and spent 19 years letting it become something useful. She hugged him. It surprised him she felt the half-second of his adjustment, the moment of recalibration, and then he returned it the way someone returns something they didn't know they needed to give back. "Tell Cal I said thank you," she said. He'll say you don't owe him, Victor said. Tell him anyway, she said. She stepped back. Victor looked at her for a moment at the office around her, at the desk and the framed letter, and the window that looked out over the parking lot where 3 cars were waiting for tomorrow morning. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they are committing to memory, not because they're leaving forever, but because some moments deserve to be kept. Your father built a garage, he said. She knew what was coming. She'd heard a version of it before in this same room from this same man, but the version that was coming now was the real one, the full one, the one he'd been working toward for months without knowing the shape of it until this moment. You built a family, he said. She held his gaze. Go ride, she said. Be safe. He nodded once. He walked out. She heard the shovel head start in the parking lot, heard it idle for a moment, heard it move out onto the street and build to highway speed, and then fade, the sound dropping through its frequencies, the way a sound drops when distance takes it smaller and smaller until it was gone, and the ordinary noise of the garage came back in around the space it had left. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then she turned around and went back to work. September brought the first anniversary of the break-in. Sophie noticed the date when she was filling in the shop calendar and saw it sitting there plain as any other date, the particular Tuesday in September when everything had changed. She looked at it for a moment, then she wrote in the day's appointments. Jesse had a transmission job. George was coming in for a BMW fleet service. Ray had 2 regulars in the morning, and she turned the page. She had learned something about anniversaries. The hard ones were not the ones that came with ceremony. They were the ones that arrived in the middle of a normal morning when you were doing something ordinary, and the distance between who you had been and who you were became suddenly briefly visible, like a gap in the traffic when you can see through to the other side of the road. She had been afraid that night a year ago, genuinely afraid, not the manageable kind, but the kind that goes down to the bone and stays there for a while. She had stood in the middle of her father's broken garage and whispered something to the walls, and then picked up the first tool off the floor, and every subsequent thing had followed from that. Victor and Diane and Cal Briggs driving from Flagstaff, and Barb Kowalski and her tabbed folder, and Jesse Varela asking pointed questions about diagnostic equipment in a job interview, and Ray getting a raise he didn't ask for, and the new bay and the fleet accounts and the framed letter on the wall. All of it had followed from picking up one tool. She thought about what her father used to say about repair work, that every job started with the same thing, which was not a tool or a part or a diagnosis. It was a decision, the decision that the thing was worth fixing and that you were the person who was going to fix it. She had made that decision on a Tuesday night in September while the rain came down and her hands were shaking. Everything else was just the work. Victor called from somewhere in Northern California on a Wednesday in late September. She was eating lunch at her father's desk, a sandwich, a coffee, the particular combination of briefly doing nothing that counted as a break when her phone rang with the unfamiliar area code she'd learned to recognize as wherever he happened to be. How's the shop, he said. It was always his first question. Good, she said. Jesse finished a full engine rebuild on a '98 Jeep Cherokee yesterday that the dealership had told the owner was beyond repair. She did it in 4 days. Owner cried. That's a good first rebuild, Victor said. It's a great first rebuild, Sophie said. I told her so. She said she knew, which is exactly what she should have said. Victor made the sound that contained laugh. How's Ray handling her? He bought her coffee yesterday morning without being asked, Sophie said, which for Ray is equivalent to a formal adoption. He's a good man, Victor said. The best, she said. Where are you? Somewhere south of Eureka, he said. Cal knows a place near the coast. We've been riding the Route 1 curves. A pause. It's been good, Sophie. I forgot what it feels like to just ride. When are you coming back? 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3. A pause. I'll be back for October. I'll have coffee ready, she said. I know you will, he said. He paused again and she heard the sound of wind of distance, of the particular open quality of air that belongs to somewhere very large. How are you, he said. She looked around the office, at the desk, at the framed letter, at the window through which she could see the parking lot and both bays running and Jesse's legs visible under a Subaru on the left lift and George's silver hair bent over an engine on the right. At the anniversary date on the calendar that had been and gone quietly like all honest things go. "I'm good, Victor," she said. And she meant it with the whole weight of what she'd been through to get there, through the break-in and the supplier calls and the regulatory filings and 34 motorcycles on a December road and a letter written in her father's hand and a woman from Montrose with a tab folder and a consent decree in the public record and two new mechanics who were already making the garage something her father might not have recognized but absolutely would have been proud of. She meant it with all of that, every ounce of it, without editing any piece of it out. "I'm good," she said again because it was worth saying twice. The shop ran behind her. The lifts held. The tools were in their places, every hook labeled in handwriting she knew better than her own. The sign above the door said Mitchell Classic Garage in the same letters it had said it for 35 years, through everything the world had brought to that door and everything that had walked back out. Some things are built to last, not because they're made of the hardest material, but because they're made of the right one. Because somewhere at the foundation of them is a decision made once held to absolutely never revisited about what kind of place this is going to be and what kind of person is going to run it. Tom Mitchell had made that decision in 1989. Sophie Mitchell had made it again on a Tuesday night in September and on her knees on an oil-stained floor, with her father's tools scattered around her, and Mitchell Classic Garage, which had survived 35 years, and one man's greed and one woman's refusal, and 34 riders on a cold December night, and the long memory of people who paid their debts in the currency of showing up. Mitchell Classic Garage was open. It was going to stay open. That was never in question anymore.